Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey dear friends, what if one of North America's greatest mysteries wasn't hidden in the sky, but buried beneath the Mississippi River? For more than 1,000 years, Native American communities passed down stories of something unusual beneath these ancient waters. To outsiders, they sounded like myths, stories told around fires and handed down through generations. But what if those stories weren't legends at all? Today, scientists are uncovering evidence that suggests the Mississippi has been hiding extraordinary secrets for centuries. Buried beneath layers of mud and time lie traces of ancient earthquakes, forgotten landscapes, and discoveries that are changing what we thought we knew about North America's past. Could traditional knowledge have preserved the memory of real events long before modern science existed? Before starting the story, like and subscribe to my channel for more stories. Now, start the story. Tonight, we'll journey through native oral traditions, archaeological discoveries, and the latest scientific research to explore one of the most fascinating mysteries beneath the Mississippi River. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's uncover the ancient secret hidden beneath America's greatest river. There exists a river at the very heart of this continent, a river that almost everyone believes they already know. You have traced its path on maps since childhood, that familiar winding blue line that starts in the north among the lakes of Minnesota and stretches all the way south to the warm waters of the Gulf. A line that seems to divide the land in two, like a backbone or a scar, or maybe like a seam stitched together by some unseen hand. A seam that was never quite made perfectly straight. You know its nicknames: the Old Man, the Father of Waters, the Mighty Mississippi. A clear image forms in your mind without even trying. An image of something broad and brown and slow-moving. A force that carries everything along with it, patient and unstoppable. You believe you understand what this river is, but the truth is, you have only scratched the surface. What the river truly is, and what hides beneath its surface, and what existed here long before any person alive today was born to remember it, is something so profound, so strange, so quietly immense, that when the scientists finally began to truly examine it, not just glance at it, but really study the river and the landscape that holds its memory, the sediment that preserves everything the water has ever come into contact with, the marks pressed into the earth that remain despite centuries of flood and drought, despite all the forgetting that time brings. When they finally started their work in earnest, they found something that should not have been a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention, because people had been trying to tell them for 1,000 years, and in some cases much longer than that. The native elders all along the banks of the Mississippi had been sharing the same message in many different tongues, through many different rituals, through stories that outsiders jotted down in notebooks and stored away in archives, stories they did not value because they were just tales, because they were passed down by word of mouth, because they did not look like the kind of evidence they were trained to trust. They appeared to be myths, yet they were anything but myths. They were the most precise and enduring system of record-keeping our species has ever created for holding onto the memory of the land. And what they held on to, what they had so carefully passed from elder to student to child to grandchild, generation after generation, in an unbroken chain of memory reaching back further than any European document ever written on this soil, was information about what is hidden beneath the Mississippi. What was constructed there, what was concealed there, what occurred there, and why you should look at the river in a way you have never looked at anything before. Because the river, as it turns out, is not merely a body of water. It is a keeper of records. It is a monument. It is the longest archive in the entire history of North America. And the secrets it has been safeguarding are only now, in the most tentative and breathtaking ways, beginning to emerge. If you're listening to this to help you drift off to sleep, then that is precisely the reason I create these recordings. Perhaps you could subscribe and let me know in the comments where you are right now and what time it is. I always read them, and it truly stays with me. someone in Memphis at midnight, someone in Minnesota watching the snow fall, someone in New Orleans where the river is just outside and you can hear its voice if you open the window. All of us gathered around the same story at the same moment, separated by miles and time zones, but bound together by a shared curiosity about the world that existed before any of us arrived. That is the real essence of the Mississippi. It links everything together. It always has. It was linking civilizations and trade routes and ceremonial systems and ecological connections long before anyone dreamed of putting a steamboat on it or building a levee along its edges. And the story of what it was linking and what got buried when the world above it transformed is what we will spend the next several hours exploring together in the quiet. So let's begin at a starting point, though it is not truly the beginning, because the genuine beginning is so ancient that we can only approach it indirectly, through subtle clues that take decades of patient work to assemble before anyone feels confident enough to voice what those clues are pointing towards. But there is a place we can begin that will give you your bearings, that will help you grasp the scale of what we are discussing before we venture deeper. Picture yourself standing on the bank of the Mississippi at just the right spot and just the right time of year. Imagine it is dusk in late autumn, when the water is low and the fading light is turning golden over the Missouri bluffs on the far shore, and the sandbars are exposed, long pale crescents of river sediment that appear and vanish with the seasons. The water is moving with that particular late fall rhythm, not the urgent, swollen rush of the spring melt, but a more deliberate, purposeful flow that seems to know its destination and feels no need to rush. Stand there and try to truly comprehend what you are seeing. You are not merely looking at water. You are looking at time itself. You are gazing upon roughly 12,000 years of post-glacial history, all of it encoded in the very shape of the valley around you. Every curve the river makes, every abandoned oxbow, lake sitting to the side like a half-finished thought, every slough and backwater and bayou branching off into the forest, every terrace carved into the bluffs above you where the ancient river once flowed before it changed course. All of it is a record, a physical, three-dimensional, geologically preserved account of everything that has taken place in this valley throughout the entire span of human presence on this continent. And humans have been present here for a very long time. That is the first crucial point to grasp. The Mississippi River Valley was not some remote backwater of North American prehistory. It was not a place where people just happened to settle after all the important events had already unfolded elsewhere. By every measure modern archaeology has at its disposal, it was one of the most densely populated, intensively developed, and culturally sophisticated regions in the entire Western Hemisphere. The civilizations that rose and fell along this river over the last 4,000 years, and likely even longer, were not simple encampments. They were not groups of wandering people living day to day, with no knowledge of engineering or astronomy or trade, or the kind of civic organization needed to build lasting things. They were complex urban societies with trading networks stretching from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, from the Atlantic coast to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. They had genuine cities. They had populations that in some cases rivaled the major capitals of contemporary Europe. They had belief systems sophisticated enough to align their largest structures with celestial events with a precision that still impresses engineers today. They had everything, in short, that we associate with civilization, and most of it now rests beneath the river, or beneath the mud beside the river, or is preserved in the memories of the descendants who are still here, still speaking, still trying to tell us what we have not yet learned to hear. The warnings of the elders are where we must start, because they are the thread that connects all the rest. They are the reason this story exists. The reason we have a specific set of questions to ask of the sediment and the ruins and the satellite images. The reason scientists ended up looking into places they did and finding what they found. Without those oral traditions, without that persistent cross-generational memory of the people who lived along this river and who continue to live here even after everything changed, we would be starting with nothing. We would be discovering things without understanding what we were uncovering. We would be finding answers without knowing what the questions were. But instead, we have a guide. It is encoded in stories that non-native scholars initially dismissed as simple legend, as mythology, as the kind of symbolic narrative that cultures create to make sense of things they cannot yet explain through science. But that view was always mistaken. The oral traditions were not symbolic approximations of experiences too complex for pre-scientific minds to process correctly. They were scientific observations, encoded in a form that could survive for centuries without the need for paper or archives or institutional support. A form that required active human care and therefore naturally selected, over time, for the information most crucial to preserve. What the elders chose to remember, chose to encode in ritual and narrative and song, and in the specific geography of sacred places, was precisely what was important, precisely what was true. And what they chose to remember about the Mississippi is remarkable. The Osage people, who lived for many generations along the Missouri and Arkansas rivers that feed into the Mississippi system, have always spoken of the greater river valley not as a simple geographic feature, but as a system of connections, a web of relationships between the living and the dead, between the world above the surface and the world beneath, between what can be seen and what has been hidden but not therefore vanished. Their traditions speak of a time when the land along the river was dramatically different from how it appears today. When certain places that are now open water or dense forest were once elevated ground. When structures stood at particular bends in the river that have long since disappeared below the surface. They describe these things not with the vagueness of legend, but with the clarity of eyewitness testimony. There are references to materials, to specific kinds of stone, to the way certain buildings were oriented, to the particular uses certain places were put to. That level of detail is not the mark of invented mythology. It is the mark of memory. The Chickasaw people, whose ancestral lands include much of what is now western Tennessee and northern Mississippi, carry oral histories that describe a great change in the land, a change that elders, when pressed, date to a time before European written history, but after the peak of what archaeologists would later call the Mississippian cultural period, a time when the river itself shifted its course in certain places, when things that had been above ground went below it, when communities that had lived in particular river bends for generations had to relocate because the land they had built upon became something other than land. These traditions have been recorded by ethnographers since the early 20th century, and for most of that time they were treated as interesting cultural artifacts rather than as historical evidence. The shift in how researchers view them is recent. It is still not complete, but it is happening, and what it is revealing is that the elders were not speaking in metaphors. They were giving reports. The Quapaw people, who have inhabited the lower Mississippi region since time beyond memory, have a particularly rich body of oral tradition concerning the river and what lies beneath it. Their ceremonial practices include specific orientations toward features of the river that outsiders historically found confusing, because the features referenced in the ceremonies do not seem to correspond to anything visible on the modern landscape. River bends that no longer bend as they once did, elevated banks that are now underwater, confluences that moved when the river moved. For generations, scholars who encountered these ceremonial references assumed they were symbolic, that the geographical specificity in the rituals referred to idealized or mythical places rather than actual physical locations. Then archaeologists, equipped with new remote sensing technology, began mapping the river bottom and the adjacent floodplain with unprecedented precision. And the places the ceremonies referenced, the bends and banks and confluences described in Quapaw oral tradition, began to appear on the maps. Not as they look now, but as they looked centuries ago, preserved in the sediment record, invisible to the naked eye, but unmistakably clear to instruments capable of seeing through mud and water to the topography beneath. That is when people began to pay attention in a different way. That is when the conversation between oral tradition and archaeology shifted from being a debate about whether the stories contain any truth to a discussion about how much truth they contain and how to uncover it without destroying it in the process. And the answer, as we will spend the rest of this journey exploring, is more truth than anyone in the mainstream scientific establishment had anticipated, encoded with a fidelity that challenges every assumption Western scholarship made for 2 centuries about the relationship between indigenous memory and geological fact. But before we delve into the archaeology, before we examine the LiDAR images and the sediment cores and the underwater surveys and the astonishing things that are slowly emerging from the mud of the Mississippi and the floodplain that surrounds it, we must first understand the river itself. We must understand what it is physically and geologically, because the river is the key to everything. The river is the reason things got buried in the first place. The river is the reason they survived their burial. The river is the reason they are detectable now, if you know where to search and have the technology to search there. And the river is the reason native oral traditions preserved information about them for so long. Because the river is also the reason the people who lived along it developed the memory systems they developed, systems designed from the very beginning to operate on the timescale of rivers, which is to say on a timescale far longer than any single human life. The Mississippi River is approximately 12,000 years old in its current general configuration, meaning it has been flowing roughly where it flows now since the end of the last ice age, when the Great Laurentide ice sheet retreated and the meltwater found its way to the Gulf through the drainage basin we now know as the Mississippi watershed. But that statement contains a subtle deception, because the river has not been flowing in a fixed channel for 12,000 years. It has been moving constantly, restlessly, with a geological patience that operates on a scale that dwarfs human civilization, yet leaves traces that human civilization can, if it pays attention, learn to interpret. The Mississippi is what geologists call a meandering river, which means it moves laterally across its floodplain over time, carving new channels as it cuts into one bank and deposits sediment on the other, sweeping back and forth across the land between the valley walls in great, slow arcs that might take centuries to complete a single bend. The river you see on a map today is merely a snapshot of a river in motion. The river that existed 500 years ago followed a different path. 1,000 years ago, different still. 2,000 years ago, different again. This is enormously important for understanding what got buried and when and where to search for it. Because every time the river moved, every time it cut a new channel or abandoned an old one, it left behind a floodplain surface that rapidly accumulated sediment. The old channel filled with silt and clay. The areas adjacent to the old banks built up with the natural levee deposits that rivers create as they flood and recede. The oxbow lakes that form when a meander gets cut off from the main channel gradually fill in with organic material, turning over centuries into rich bottomland soil that preserves everything that sank into it when it was still water. And in that preserved material, in those ancient channel fills and floodplain deposits and oxbow lake sediments, is everything the river carried and everything that was built along its banks before it moved, which, as it turns out, is quite a lot. The other thing to understand about the Mississippi is its relationship to flood. The river floods. This is not a failure or an anomaly or a product of recent climate change. Though climate affects the frequency and severity of floods, it is the fundamental nature of the river, built into its hydrology and its geomorphology and its ancient relationship with the landscape through which it flows. The Mississippi has always flooded. It flooded before Europeans arrived and misunderstood the floodplain as an used agricultural land and built cities upon it. It flooded in patterns that the people who lived along it for thousands of years understood and had adapted to, building their permanent structures on the elevated ridges of ancient natural levees and their seasonal camps in the lands that flooded every spring and dried out every summer to produce the richest agricultural soil on the continent. They understood the river the way you understand a temperamental but generous neighbor you have lived beside your whole life. and your parents lived beside their whole life, and their parents before them, which is to say, not as something to be controlled or tamed or redirected, but as something to be read and respected and worked with on its own terms. That understanding, that deep ecological literacy about how the river behaves and why, is encoded in the oral traditions. It is why the elders knew where things were buried. Not because they had supernatural access to geological information, but because they had been watching the river long enough that they understood how it worked, which meant they understood where it had been and what it had covered when it moved. The oral traditions did not need to contain explicit geological knowledge. They just needed to accurately record where things had been built and what happened to those things when the river changed. The rest, the part about what that means in terms of sediment depth and channel migration and preservation potential, was always going to be figured out eventually by scientists with the right tools. The oral traditions simply provided the map. Let's consider the nature of the elder warnings. Because this phrase, the warnings, is something I want to be precise about. When I say that native elders warned for 1,000 years about what lies beneath the Mississippi, I am not speaking of warnings in an apocalyptic sense. Not the kind of warning that arrives in a dream vision with a sense of cosmic dread attached to it. I am speaking of something more specific, and in some ways more interesting. I am speaking of the kind of warning that comes from sustained multi-generational observation of a landscape combined with the accumulated interpretive framework of a ceremonial tradition that has been refining its understanding of that landscape for centuries. This is the kind of warning that sounds like "do not build there," because that place floods in a pattern you do not understand yet. This is the kind of warning that sounds like there is something beneath that bend in the river that should not be disturbed. This is the kind of warning that sounds like the ancestors placed things in certain locations because those locations corresponded to alignments you cannot see from the surface, but that were visible when those things were placed. This is empirical knowledge wearing the clothing of spiritual instruction, which is how knowledge survives in oral cultures, which is why it should always be taken seriously by anyone genuinely interested in what actually happened in the past. The specific warnings that cluster around the Mississippi and its related waterways tend to fall into a few broad categories that we will explore one by one over the course of this story. There are warnings about places where the river once ran that are now dry land, and where the traces of what was there before the river moved are still present in the landscape, if you know what you're looking for. There are warnings about structures that were built along certain stretches of the river, and that went into the water when the river shifted, which is a different kind of burial than the gradual silting over of an abandoned settlement, because structures that go into the active river channel experience a different kind of preservation. And the elders seem to have understood that distinction, because they described these sites in ways that differ from how they described sites buried by gradual sedimentation. There are warnings about specific bends and confluences that were considered sacred, not because of abstract spiritual significance, but because of their function, because they marked places where astronomical alignments were visible, where trade routes converged, where the river's behavior provided specific practical information about conditions upstream or downstream. And there are warnings repeated in multiple traditions from multiple tribal nations about a time of transformation, a period that elders consistently placed several centuries in the past when something changed fundamentally about the river corridor, when things that had been above ground went below it, and when the communities that had maintained those places scattered or transformed or disappeared in ways that left very little trace in the written record, because they happened before there was a written record, at least not one made by anyone who was watching from outside. That period of transformation is where the deepest mystery lives. It is where the oral traditions converge on something that archaeology is only now beginning to corroborate. And it is where the story of what lies beneath the Mississippi gets genuinely, uncomfortably strange. But we need to build up to that. We need to lay the groundwork. We need to understand what was there before the transformation, what the Mississippi River corridor looked like at the height of what we are accustomed to calling the Mississippian period, roughly 900 to 600 years ago, when the civilization centered at Cahokia in southwestern Illinois was at or near its peak, and the river and its tributaries were functioning as the nervous system of a cultural and commercial network so extensive that it remains difficult to fully grasp even now that we have the archaeological data to sketch its outlines. Cahokia is the name most people know if they know anything at all about pre-Columbian civilization in North America. It sits on the eastern floodplain of the Mississippi, just a few miles from where the Missouri and Illinois rivers join the main stem in what is now the suburbs of St. Louis. At its peak around 900 years ago, it covered approximately 6 square miles and housed a population that archaeologists estimated somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people, with satellite communities in the surrounding region that may have brought the total metropolitan population to 100,000 or more. It had more than 100 earthen mounds of various sizes and shapes, including Monk's Mound, which at the time of its construction was the largest single structure north of Mexico, covering more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza and rising in 4 terraces to a height of about 100 feet, with a large wooden building at the top whose function can only be guessed at now because it rotted away centuries before anyone thought to document it. Cahokia is astonishing. It is also, in the context of what we are exploring tonight, just the part we can see, just the part that ended up on the right side of the river when the river moved, just the part that happened to be built on ground elevated enough that it did not go into the water. What we are interested in, what the elder warnings have always been about, is everything else. Everything that was across the river or along the river or built into the relationship with the river in ways that meant when the river moved, those things moved with it, which is to say they went under. There was a world across the river from Cahokia. There is almost no question about this anymore among specialists, though it rarely makes it into the broader cultural conversation because it is harder to describe and harder to see. On the Missouri side of the Mississippi, in the floodplain that is now buried under the industrial suburbs of St. Louis and the agricultural bottomland stretching south, there was an entire complex of sites, mounds, plazas, residential areas, and ceremonial structures that formed the western component of what was really a dual-bank urban center. The Missouri side of the Cahokia complex has been almost entirely destroyed by development and agriculture over the past 2 centuries, which means the information we have about it comes from a combination of early historical accounts, 19th century surveys conducted before the destruction was complete, and more recently from remote sensing and subsurface archaeology that can sometimes find traces even in disturbed ground. But what that information tells us is that the western bank was substantial, that it was functionally integrated with the eastern bank in ways that required regular communication and exchange across the river, and that it included structures and features that no longer exist on the surface, and whose positions, sizes, and purposes are only partially recoverable from the surviving evidence. The elder traditions about the Western Bank are among the most consistent and specific of any of the warnings attached to the Cahokia region. Multiple tribal nations with historical connections to the area, including the Osage, the Omaha, the Ponca, and others, carry oral traditions that reference a large ceremonial center on the Missouri side of the confluence. A place that is described in these traditions as having been of equal or greater spiritual significance to its counterpart on the Illinois side, and a place that the traditions consistently describe as having been at some point in the remembered past at least partially submerged by the river. The traditions are not unanimous in their specific details because oral traditions maintained by different communities over centuries naturally diverge in their particulars even when they are describing the same underlying events. But they converge on the fact of a major site on the western bank, its importance, and its eventual relationship with the water. What archaeologists have found slowly, carefully, using ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR imagery and subsurface sensing in the floodplain on the Missouri side is consistent with those traditions. There are anomalies in the subsurface, buried features that correspond to the kinds of architectural signatures that mound builder archaeology has taught researchers to recognize at positions and orientations that suggest they are not random geological features, but deliberate constructions. The sediment sequences around them are complex, showing multiple episodes of deposition that correspond to different phases of river activity. Some rapid and catastrophic in the way flood deposits are, others gradual and uniform in the way slow accretion deposits are. The picture that emerges from the sediment is of a landscape that was built on, maintained, modified, and then relatively rapidly covered by river activity, which is exactly what the oral traditions describe when they talk about the western bank going into the water. The timing is interesting. The sediment evidence suggests the most significant episode of burial on the western bank occurred somewhere in the window between 800 and 600 years ago, which corresponds to a period of known climatic instability in the Mississippi watershed that archaeologists have been studying for years in connection with the general Cahokia decline narrative. The river was active during this period in unusual ways. Flood frequencies increased. Channel migration accelerated in certain reaches. The relationship between the river and the communities that lived along it changed in ways that left traces both in the physical record, and it is becoming increasingly clear in the oral traditions of the people who experienced those changes and encoded them in forms that survived until now. To understand what went into the river and why it stayed there, we have to understand something about how rivers bury things, because this is not intuitive, and the non-intuitive part of it is actually where the interesting information lives. The common assumption is that burial by a river is destructive, that when a structure or a settlement or a landscape goes into the water, what you get is erosion, which is to say destruction, which is to say loss. And sometimes that is true. The active channel of the Mississippi, the main current, is genuinely destructive. It scours the riverbed. It moves enormous quantities of material downstream. It has the energy in flood conditions to shift boulders and carve new channels through solid earth. If a structure ends up in the active channel, the odds of it surviving in any recognizable form are not good. But that is not the only way a river buries things. The Mississippi is not just its active channel. It is a complex system of related environments, each of which has its own depositional behavior, its own burial mechanics, its own relationship to time and preservation. The floodplain adjacent to the active channel, particularly the areas behind the natural levees that the river builds on its own banks, is one of the most preservation-friendly environments on Earth because it receives fine-grained sediment during floods. When the river overtops its banks and spreads out across the land, it drops the silt and clay it has been carrying because the water has slowed down. And that fine sediment blankets everything it covers and excludes oxygen and inhibits bacterial decay and creates the conditions under which organic material, wood and bone, and plant fiber, and even cloth, can survive for centuries or millennia if the right chemical conditions are maintained. Swamps and bayous and backwater lakes, the secondary water bodies that are permanently or seasonally connected to the main river, are even better in some respects because the standing water in these environments creates reducing conditions in the sediment that are particularly favorable to organic preservation. Archaeologists have pulled wooden structures and tool handles and cordage out of Mississippi River floodplain deposits that are centuries old and still hold their shape, still show the tool marks of the people who worked them, still sometimes even show the grain of the original wood clearly enough to identify the species of tree. This means that things buried by the Mississippi, if they went into the right part of the system at the right moment, are not gone. They are preserved. They are sitting in the mud at depths that range from a few feet to tens of feet below the current surface, depending on how long ago they went in and how actively the floodplain in that area has been building up since. And they are findable in principle by anyone with the right combination of remote sensing technology and the patience and resources to apply it systematically to the question. The reason it has taken so long for mainstream archaeology to seriously pursue this kind of work along the Mississippi is not a lack of technology, because the technology has existed for several decades. It is a combination of funding constraints, jurisdictional complexity, and what you might diplomatically call a perceptual legacy, which is the less diplomatic term for the deeply embedded assumption that the most important things to know about pre-Columbian North America are already known, that the major sites have already been found and described, that the picture is incomplete in its details, but basically correct in its outlines. This assumption is wrong. It has always been wrong. The oral traditions always implied that it was wrong, which is one of the reasons the oral traditions were dismissed, because taking them seriously would have required taking seriously the idea that the established picture of North American prehistory was missing something enormous, which turned out to be the truth. Let's discuss what specifically has been found in recent years, because the catalog is more extensive than most people realize and the pace of discovery is accelerating, which means the story is genuinely unfolding in real time. The field of underwater and below-surface archaeology along the Mississippi corridor has been transformed in the last 15 years by the arrival of several technologies that work particularly well in this environment. The first is LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging, and which works by shooting laser pulses from an aircraft at the ground surface below and measuring the time it takes for each pulse to bounce back, building up a three-dimensional model of the topography below at a resolution fine enough to detect features on the scale of individual house platforms or earthen walls. The reason LiDAR is so useful in the Mississippi corridor is that the floodplain is almost entirely forested in its undeveloped stretches, and conventional aerial photography cannot see through the forest canopy to the ground below. LiDAR can, because the laser pulses slip through gaps in the canopy and bounce off the actual surface beneath. The result is a topographic map that shows you the landscape as if the trees were not there. In regions where this technology has been applied, the results have been consistently stunning, not just in the Mississippi corridor, but everywhere in the Americas where major pre-Columbian sites were expected, because it turns out that the geography of pre-Columbian development in the Americas is dramatically more extensive than the above-ground visible record had suggested. In the Mississippi watershed specifically, LiDAR surveys conducted over the last decade in areas adjacent to the main channel and along major tributaries have revealed features that were completely invisible to previous investigators. Subtle earthen ridges that turn out to be the remnants of causeways connecting elevated settlement areas to lower agricultural zones. Low mounds that were too small and too damaged by plowing and erosion to show up as obvious architectural features from the ground or from conventional aerial photography, but that pop out clearly in LiDAR images as slight but unmistakable elevations in the floodplain surface. Plaza depressions, the flat, carefully leveled central spaces that Mississippian communities maintained in their town centers as ceremonial and civic gathering areas, that are now barely distinguishable from the surrounding terrain by eye, but that LiDAR reveals as precisely bounded flat surfaces surrounded by the low ridges of ancient midden deposits and structural foundations. Palisade lines, the remnants of defensive wooden walls that protected many Mississippian communities, that have rotted away to nothing but left slight soil discolorations and extremely subtle microtopographic traces that LiDAR can sometimes resolve. The quantity of new sites being identified through LiDAR in the Mississippi floodplain is extraordinary, and the sites are consistently described by the archaeologists who study them as more complex, more extensive, and more densely distributed than the pre-LiDAR picture would have predicted. But LiDAR only works on the land surface. For what lies beneath the river itself, beneath the water and the sediment that the water has deposited over centuries of active channel migration, you need something different. You need acoustic remote sensing, specifically side-scan sonar and sub-bottom profiling systems that can map the topography of the riverbed and, crucially, can see through the sediment on the riverbed to the layers below. Side-scan sonar works by emitting sound pulses sideways from a towed instrument and measuring the reflections to build up a picture of the riverbed surface. Sub-bottom profiling goes a step further, using lower frequency sound that penetrates the sediment and reflects off-density contrasts within the sediment column, revealing the stratigraphy below the current surface. Together, these tools can reveal buried topographic features on the riverbed. Features like the remains of earthen mounds that were located on the riverbank before the channel migrated, and are now sitting beneath the water, buried to varying depths in river sediment, but still detectable as anomalies in the acoustic record. The application of these tools to the Mississippi has been uneven. The Army Corps of Engineers, which manages navigation on the river and has extensive sonar data from years of channel surveys focused on navigation hazards, has data sets that cover much of the main channel. But this data was collected for engineering purposes rather than archaeological purposes, and was not specifically designed to detect the kinds of anomalies that a buried mound complex would produce. Some of this data has been reanalyzed by researchers looking for archaeological signatures with interesting results in a few specific locations. But systematic archaeological sub-bottom profiling of the Mississippi, designed from the ground up to look for buried cultural features, has been done only in a limited number of locations and only relatively recently. The results in those locations have been significant enough that there is considerable pressure from archaeologists who work in the region to expand the surveys, but funding and logistics remain challenging. What the acoustic surveys have found in the locations where they have been done is a riverbed that is not blank. The Mississippi riverbed, at least in certain stretches, and particularly in the meander zone in the middle and lower river, contains anomalies that are consistent with buried cultural features. The most convincing of these anomalies take the form of regularly spaced, geometrically patterned reflective surfaces buried at depths that, given the known rates of sedimentation in the relevant river reaches, correspond to ages in the Mississippian period or earlier. They are not definitively identified as cultural features. Archaeological sub-bottom profiling is a probabilistic science, not a definitive one, and the difference between a buried earthen mound and a natural sedimentary feature that happens to have a similar acoustic signature is not always obvious without physical sampling, which means actually going down and taking a sediment core through the anomaly and looking at what the core contains. But the anomalies exist. They are real, and in the opinion of the researchers who have examined the data, a significant number of them warrant further investigation. In one stretch of the river in the lower Mississippi, in the reach between Memphis and Vicksburg, acoustic surveys conducted in the early 2010s identified a cluster of anomalies in the sub-bottom data that attracted particular attention. The anomalies were located in an area where the channel was known from historical maps to have migrated substantially over the past 2 centuries, meaning the current channel was cutting through what had been dry land, or at least floodplain, as recently as the 18th century. The acoustic signatures were consistent with buried earthen features, and their spatial arrangement, the way they clustered and related to each other, was suggestive of a planned layout rather than a random distribution of natural features. A sediment core was taken through one of the anomalies, and the material it brought up was described by the researchers as consistent with archaeological fill, which is the kind of mixed, human-disturbed sediment that you typically find inside an earthen mound, as distinct from the layered, undisturbed sediment of natural floodplain deposits. The core also contained charcoal and other organic material that was submitted for radiocarbon dating. And the dates that came back placed the material in the Mississippian period, specifically in the 12th and 13th centuries, which corresponds to the period of maximum Mississippian cultural development in that region. This is not proof of a buried city beneath the Mississippi. It is evidence, good evidence, of buried cultural features of Mississippian age in a stretch of the river where the channel has migrated over formerly inhabited ground. But the elder traditions of the Choctaw and Chickasaw people, both of whom have deep ancestral connections to the central Mississippi Valley, include references to settlements in that general area that the traditions describe as having been compromised by river activity in the distant past. And the traditions include a level of geographic specificity about the location of these settlements that, when mapped against the acoustic anomaly data, produces a correspondence that researchers describe with a characteristic scientific caution, but that if you allow yourself to look at it plainly, is quite remarkable. The Choctaw oral traditions in question are preserved in several forms. They appear in the accounts of elders recorded by ethnographers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They appear in the ceremonial practices of the Choctaw Nation, which include specific geographical orientations and references to ancestral places that the ceremonies acknowledge without fully describing, in a way that sacred knowledge tends to be transmitted in forms that require initiated understanding to decode. And they appear in the geographical knowledge embedded in Choctaw place names, many of which refer to landscape features that no longer exist in the form implied by the name. Features that, when you understand what the names mean and where they were applied, describe a river valley that looked different from the way it looks today, different in ways that match the paleogeographic reconstruction you can build from the geological evidence, different in ways that imply sustained, accurate observation of a landscape over centuries, accurate enough to preserve information about features that are now underwater. The Chickasaw traditions on the subject are different in their specifics, but compatible in their general outlines. The Chickasaw have particularly detailed oral accounts of a period they describe as the time of the Great Water, a phrase that sounds mythological until you understand that it corresponds in its timing and its geographic range as described in the traditions to a real hydrological event. Specifically, the traditions describe a period of extraordinary flooding in the central Mississippi Valley that lasted for what sounds like multiple seasons, that covered areas that were normally well above flood level, and that was followed by a permanent change in the river's behavior and position. This is not a local legend about a single flood. It is a description of a major hydrological disruption that had lasting landscape consequences. And it is precisely the kind of event that the geological record in the region, when examined with modern sedimentological methods, shows evidence of having occurred in the right general time period and with the right general characteristics. The period the Chickasaw traditions point to, based on the contextual clues in the oral accounts, falls somewhere in the late Mississippian period, roughly 5 to 7 centuries ago. This corresponds to a climatic period that paleoclimatologists have identified in the tree ring record, the sediment record, and the isotopic record of the central United States as a period of increased flood frequency and magnitude, driven by changes in atmospheric circulation patterns associated with the broader climatic instability of the late medieval period. The river was doing unusual things during this time. The record shows it, the traditions say it, and the landscape, when you know how to read it, shows the scars. Now, I want to take you somewhere specific, because abstract discussion of oral traditions and acoustic anomalies can start to feel unmoored from the physical world, and the physical world is where this story actually lives. I want to take you to the river itself, to a particular stretch of it that has become one of the most intensively studied sections from the perspective of this kind of buried landscape archaeology, and walk you through what is known and what is suspected and what is still unknown in a way that gives you a sense of the actual experience of working in this kind of environment. The bend in the Mississippi just south of the confluence with the Arkansas River is a place that has been studied and argued over and returned to again and again by researchers who work in this field for reasons that have to do with both what the geology says and what the oral traditions say, and with the fact that both sources of information seem to be pointing at the same thing. Geologically, this stretch of the river shows clear evidence of significant channel migration in the last 1,000 years, with the main channel having shifted laterally by as much as several miles in some reaches, which means the current river is running through territory that was dry land as recently as 500 or 600 years ago. The abandoned channel traces, the oxbow lakes and scroll bar sequences and clay plugs that mark where the river used to be, are visible in aerial photography and especially in LiDAR imagery. And they tell a story of a river that moved relatively quickly through this area during the period in question, not gradually over centuries, but in what geologists describe as episodic avulsion events, sudden shifts when the river abandons one channel and captures a new one, which, in terms of archaeological preservation, means that the landscape the river moved through may have had little warning and little time for the communities that live there to remove their most substantial structures. The oral traditions associated with this bend come primarily from the Quapaw, who have the most direct ancestral connections to this specific stretch of the river. The Quapaw call this area by a name that translates roughly as the place where the old ones went into the water, which is a phrase that has been noted in the literature for over a century without anyone taking it particularly literally. Recent research suggests it should be taken quite literally. The Quapaw tradition describes a time when a major settlement in this area was affected by a sudden change in the river's course. Not a gradual flooding, but a rapid shift that brought the main channel directly through or immediately adjacent to the settlement. The tradition describes the kinds of things that were at the settlement, the types of structures, the nature of the ceremonial features, the way the community was oriented in relation to the river, in enough detail that researchers working on the acoustic survey data from this stretch of the river have been able to use the traditional descriptions as a guide for where to look and what to look for. What they have found is not yet publicly reported in full, because the work is ongoing and the researchers are appropriately cautious about making claims before they have completed the necessary verification. But the preliminary indications, based on what has been shared at conferences and in informal communications with colleagues, are that the Quapaw tradition is describing something real. Let's pause here and think about what it means for a tradition to be describing something real in this context, because this is a question worth sitting with. The conventional model for how oral traditions work, at least the model that most Western scholars operated from for most of the 20th century, was essentially a telephone game model. Stories get passed from teller to teller, and each teller changes them a little, and over centuries the changes accumulate until the story bears little resemblance to whatever it originally described. On this model, oral traditions might be broadly true in some thematic sense, while being unreliable as sources of specific historical or geographic information. This model is not entirely wrong. Oral traditions do change over time, and the study of how they change and why is a rich field with its own insights. But the model is seriously incomplete because it does not account for the role of active, intentional maintenance and how oral traditions work in cultures that take them seriously as repositories of important knowledge. In cultures where oral traditions are treated as sacred knowledge, where the transmission is ritualized and verified by community process, where deviations from the established version are corrected by elders who hold the authoritative form in memory, oral traditions can maintain a high degree of fidelity to their original content over very long periods of time. And the content that tends to be maintained with the highest fidelity is content that is in some sense testable or verifiable by the community. Content that relates to real places and real events that members of the community can observe and compare with the tradition's description. Traditions about the behavior of particular landscape features, about the locations of resources, about the nature of specific places, tend to be well maintained because they're useful, because they are regularly checked against reality, and because inaccuracies in them have real consequences for the people who rely on them. The Quapaw tradition about what lies beneath that particular bend of the river is the kind of tradition that, if it were significantly wrong in its specifics, would have been quietly corrected or discarded by the community a long time ago, because traditions that are significantly wrong about the physical world tend to undermine themselves by predicting things that are not there and failing to predict things that are. The fact that the tradition persisted in detail for as long as it has is itself weak evidence that it is accurate in its essentials. And the fact that the acoustic survey data from that stretch of the river appears to be finding what the tradition says should be there is, on top of that, strong evidence that the tradition is accurate in its essentials. Now we need to talk about the submerged forest. This is one of the most extraordinary and least known features of the lower Mississippi Valley, and it is something that the oral traditions reference in ways that are specific enough to have attracted genuine scientific attention. The submerged forest of the Mississippi is not a poetic metaphor. It is a literal physical thing. At multiple locations along the lower Mississippi, particularly in the reach between Natchez and the Gulf, and also in certain sections of the Delta and in the tidal reaches near the coast, there are forests of ancient trees that are now underwater, submerged by a combination of subsidence, sea level rise, and delta sediment dynamics that have been burying the coast of Louisiana for the last several thousand years. These forests are visible in certain conditions when water clarity is high and the river is low, or when storms or dredging operations expose them, and they have been known to local people for as long as local people have been on the river, which means the native traditions about them are very old indeed. The trees themselves are remarkable. They are cypress and oak and other hardwoods, preserved by the anoxic, waterlogged conditions in which they have been sitting for centuries or millennia. Their wood is still solid enough in many cases to be cut and used as timber if they were brought to the surface. Some of them were so well preserved when first encountered that they still had bark on them. The oldest of the Louisiana submerged forests have been radiocarbon dated to ages of 4,000 years or more, which means they grew in a landscape that is now the floor of the Gulf of Mexico, a landscape that was submerged by post-glacial sea level rise and delta dynamics over the course of the last several thousand years. But the forests that are most relevant to our story are the more recent ones, the ones that the oral traditions most directly reference, which are not 4,000 years old, but somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years old, which places them squarely in the Mississippian cultural period. These younger submerged forests, the ones that date to the Mississippian and immediately post-Mississippian periods, are distributed in patterns that are not random. They cluster in areas where the oral traditions describe significant human settlement, and they cluster in ways that suggest the forests and the settlements were part of the same landscape, which is to say that the people who lived in those settlements knew those forests, used those forests, and in some cases built their structures from the timber those forests provided. When the landscape went under, the forest went under with it. And when researchers examine the stumps and fallen logs of these younger submerged forests, they sometimes find evidence of human activity in the surrounding sediment. Charcoal, stone tool fragments, ceramic shards, the mundane debris of daily life that survives burial remarkably well when the burial conditions are right. They find evidence that the forests were not uninhabited when they went under, that people were there, and that the going under was not so gradual that the people had centuries to adjust, but happened in a time frame compressed enough that it left a physical record of disruption rather than orderly abandonment. The oral traditions of the Houma and the Tunica Biloxi, both of whom have deep ancestral connections to the lower Mississippi and the Louisiana coast, include accounts of the loss of land that is now underwater. These accounts are sometimes categorized by researchers as flood myths, placed in the same general category as the flood narratives found in cultures around the world. And there is some justice in that categorization, because they do share structural features with flood narratives from other traditions. But they also contain geographical specifics that set them apart from purely mythological narratives. The Houma traditions describe particular places by name, places that are now underwater, and they describe what was at those places in terms that are consistent with the kinds of archaeological features that researchers find in the submerged sediments of the Louisiana coast when they go looking. The correspondences are not perfect, and they are not always precise, because centuries of transmission have compressed and simplified some details and amplified others. But the basic claim that specific places of cultural significance went under within cultural memory is supported by the archaeology. The Tunica Biloxi traditions are particularly interesting in this regard, because they include a very specific account of a shift in the river that affected a ceremonial site. The tradition describes a place that was used for intercommunity gatherings, a place where people from a broad area of the river corridor came together at specific times of year, that was located at or near a major river bend, and that was affected when the river moved and the bend moved with it, bringing the active channel through what had been dry land at the gathering site. This is not a rare type of event in the geological history of the Mississippi. Meander cutoffs happen regularly in the life of a large meandering river. And when they happen, the lateral movement of the channel can be sudden and dramatic by human standards, shifting the river's position by significant distances in a matter of years or even months, rather than the centuries that gradual meander migration might suggest. The Tunica Biloxi tradition describes this event with enough specificity, including the orientation of the site relative to the river bend, the types of features at the site, and the season in which the disruption occurred to be testable against the geological and archaeological record. And when researchers have gone to the area the tradition points to and looked at the sediment sequence and the sub-bottom sonar data, they have found evidence of a rapid channel shift of the right general age and the right general characteristics. Now all of this brings us to a question that is fundamental to understanding why this story matters, and why it has taken so long for mainstream science to engage seriously with it. The question is, why did it take 1,000 years of elder warnings to get scientists to look? This is not a rhetorical question. It has a real answer. And the real answer involves the history of how archaeology as a discipline developed in North America, the assumptions that development embedded in the field, and the specific ways those assumptions interacted with indigenous knowledge systems to create a situation where the people who knew the most about what lay beneath the Mississippi were systematically not consulted, or were consulted and then ignored for generations. Archaeology in North America was founded in the 19th century by scholars who inherited from their European intellectual tradition a set of assumptions about the nature and capabilities of pre-Columbian Native American societies that we now understand to have been wrong. The most consequential of these assumptions was what you might call the myth of the ethnographic present. The idea that Native Americans, as observed by European colonizers, represented a baseline condition of human development in the Americas, that the peoples encountered by explorers and settlers were living much as their ancestors had always lived, and that the complex archaeological sites found throughout the continent, the mounds, the earthworks, the evidence of large-scale agricultural and engineering projects, were therefore not made by the ancestors of the living native people, but by some lost, more advanced civilization that had preceded them. This idea, which was articulated in various forms throughout the 19th century and persisted in some quarters well into the 20th, served multiple purposes, including the ideological purpose of diminishing native claims to ancestral territory by suggesting that the people making those claims were not in fact the descendants of the people who had built the most impressive things in that territory. It was wrong, demonstrably wrong, and has been shown to be wrong by genetics and by careful archaeology and by the oral traditions themselves. But its legacy persists in the institutional assumptions and funding priorities of American archaeology in ways that are still being untangled. One of those legacies is the consistent underinvestment in research programs that take indigenous oral traditions seriously as sources of archaeological data. For most of the 20th century, the dominant methodological framework in American archaeology held that the oral traditions of living native peoples were interesting as cultural artifacts, but could not be relied upon as sources of information about specific historical events more than a few generations in the past. This framework was based on the telephone game model of oral tradition that we discussed earlier, combined with a general skepticism about the possibility of accurate knowledge transmission over long periods without writing. The framework was wrong, as we have discussed, but it was influential, and its influence meant that the kind of research that takes an oral tradition as a starting point for an archaeological investigation, the kind of research that asks, what if the tradition is accurate, and what would we find if we went and looked where it points, was underfunded and institutionally marginalized for decades. The shift has been slow, and it is still incomplete, but it is real. The passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990 changed the institutional relationship between archaeologists and Native communities in important ways, partly by requiring consultation, and partly by creating the conditions for ongoing relationships that over time produced more genuine collaboration. The growing recognition of oral traditions as legitimate historical sources in both history and archaeology has been driven by specific cases where oral traditions turned out to be verifiable, where they predicted things that archaeology subsequently found, where the correspondence between traditional knowledge and physical evidence was clear enough that ignoring the tradition would have been methodologically indefensible. Those cases have accumulated over the last 3 decades to a point where the argument for taking oral traditions seriously is now mainstream in the relevant academic disciplines. even if the full methodological implications of that argument have not yet worked their way through all the relevant research programs. In the Mississippi case, specifically, the shift has also been driven by technology. The tools that can see what lies beneath the river and the floodplain have made the elder warnings testable in ways they were not previously testable. And when they were tested, the results were interesting enough to justify continued investment. This is a pattern that appears repeatedly in the history of the relationship between indigenous knowledge and Western science. The knowledge was always there. The traditions were always saying what they were saying, and the limitation was not in the knowledge but in the scientific capacity to verify it. When the capacity catches up to the knowledge, the results tend to be humbling for the scientific establishment and vindicating for the tradition keepers. Let me take you into the water now. Let me take you through the experience of what it is actually like to work in this environment, because it is stranger and more beautiful and more physically demanding than you might imagine. And the strangeness of it is part of what gives the story its texture. The archaeologists and geologists who work in the Mississippi corridor, particularly those who work in the water itself or in the soft, waterlogged sediments of the floodplain, work in conditions that are unlike almost anything else in archaeological fieldwork. The river is not hospitable to research in the way that, say, an upland desert site is hospitable, where you walk in with your tools and your water and you work in a landscape that is dry and stable and essentially static. The river changes constantly. It changes with the seasons, rising and falling by tens of feet between low water and flood stage. It changes with the weather, because even events far upstream in the watershed affect what the river does at any given point along its length. It changes with the passage of each barge tow, which pushes a wave ahead of it and creates a wake behind it that disturbs the soft sediments on the riverbed and can destroy the surface detail of a sub-bottom sonar survey if the instrument happens to be deployed when the barge passes. Working in this environment requires a different kind of patience and a different kind of physical relationship to the work than most archaeologists are accustomed to. The people who are best adapted to working in this environment, who have the deepest knowledge of how to read and move through this landscape, are the people whose families have been doing it for generations. The commercial fishermen and barge crew workers and recreational boaters who have spent their lives on the river know things about its behavior that no amount of remote sensing data can fully substitute for. They know which bends scour deep in high water and fill with sandbars at low water. They know which stretches tend to produce anomalous currents that indicate changes in the riverbed below. They know the places where the bottom has a particular feel to it, a particular resistance that experienced boatmen associate with hard material not far below the mud. Some of these practical navigational observations turn out to be archaeologically interesting when examined in light of what the acoustic survey data shows. And the best research programs in the region have learned to include these practical knowledge holders in their planning and their fieldwork. And then there are the tribal members who work as cultural monitors in archaeological investigations conducted in their ancestral territories. This role, which has become increasingly standard in American archaeology, involves having a community member present at the investigation who can observe the work, flag cultural or spiritual concerns, and contribute traditional knowledge that might be relevant to interpreting what is found. In the Mississippi work, cultural monitors have been present in some of the most significant investigations, and their contributions have ranged from pointing out that a feature interpreted by the archaeologists as a storage pit was based on traditional knowledge about the uses of such features, more likely a ritual deposit, to providing information about the specific traditional significance of a particular location that helped researchers understand why that location was chosen for the feature being investigated. The monitors are not just observers, they are collaborators, and the knowledge they bring is not supplementary to the archaeology. It is in many cases the most direct and accurate source of interpretive framework available. One of the most consistent themes in what cultural monitors and tradition holders contribute to the Mississippi archaeology is a correction of scale. The academic archaeology of the Mississippian period has for most of its history focused on the most visible and monumental aspects of Mississippian material culture. The big mounds, the large plazas, the elite burial goods, the prestige artifact networks that connected major ceremonial centers over long distances. This focus is understandable because these are the things that preserve best and are most visible archaeologically. But the oral traditions consistently describe a world that was fuller and denser and more thoroughly inhabited than the monumental archaeology suggests. They describe not just the big centers but the smaller communities that surrounded them. Not just the ceremonial structures but the everyday ones. Not just the elites but the ordinary people who built the whole thing and did most of the work and whose everyday lives are the least visible in the archaeological record and the most persistently remembered in the oral traditions. When tradition holders describe what they know about the Mississippian landscape, they describe a river valley that was at its peak extraordinarily densely populated, with settlements distributed along the waterways in a nearly continuous ribbon of human habitation that extended for hundreds of miles. This is a picture that the archaeology is slowly corroborating as new survey work identifies more and more small sites in the areas between the large ceremonial centers. But it has taken a long time for the academic picture to catch up to what the oral traditions were saying all along. Let me tell you about a specific discovery that illustrates the dynamic we have been discussing. A discovery that happened in the second decade of the 21st century and that received some academic attention but was not widely covered in the popular press, which is part of a pattern that we will note as we go, the pattern of significant discoveries in this field being made, documented in academic publications, and then not quite breaking through to the broader public conversation, possibly because what they suggest about the scale and sophistication of pre-Columbian civilization in North America is still at some level uncomfortable for a culture that has built much of its self-narrative on the idea that the continent was essentially empty and waiting when Europeans arrived. The discovery involved a section of the lower Mississippi floodplain in Louisiana, in an area that had been identified through LiDAR imagery as containing a dense cluster of subtle topographic anomalies. The anomalies were in an area that had been in agricultural production for over a century, and that the surface archaeology, meaning the artifacts visible on the plowed surface of the fields, had suggested was a minor, low-density site. But the LiDAR told a different story. It showed a pattern of subtle ridges and depressions that, when mapped in detail, resolved into the outlines of a planned community with at least 2 mound platforms, a central plaza, associated residential areas indicated by the ridges of ancient house platform locations, and what appeared to be evidence of a connected water management system. A series of channels and ponds whose arrangement suggested they were functional rather than natural. This was not a minor site. It was a community of substantial size and complexity, one that had been essentially invisible to previous investigators because its surface expression had been flattened by a century of plowing. What made this discovery particularly interesting in the context of our story was what happened when the research team consulted with the tribal nation that had ancestral connections to the area. The tribal historic preservation officer came to the site, and before being shown the LiDAR data, described, based on traditional knowledge, the general location of a settlement that the tradition specifically associated with a water management system, a place where the ancestors had worked with the water, as the description put it, in ways that the landscape still remembers. The correspondence between the traditional description and the LiDAR imagery was close enough that several of the researchers present described it as one of the most striking examples of oral tradition archaeology convergence they had personally encountered. The site is now on a list of locations considered for future excavation, pending resource availability and community approval. And the research program associated with it has become a model for how collaborative archaeology with indigenous knowledge holders can produce results that neither partner could have reached independently. There are more discoveries like this one. They are accumulating. They form a pattern. And the pattern, when you step back from the individual cases and look at it as a whole, is telling a story about the Mississippi River corridor that is substantially different from the story in the textbooks and closer to the story in the oral traditions. The river valley was not a sparse, periodically occupied landscape. It was a continuously inhabited, densely developed, extensively managed system of communities and waterways and ceremonial sites that stretched for hundreds of miles. And that was, at its peak, one of the most sophisticated cultural landscapes in the pre-Columbian world. Much of it is now under the water or under the mud, but it is there. Now, let me tell you about the canal networks, because this is something that has not received the attention it deserves, and that the oral traditions have been describing for a very long time in ways that most researchers historically did not take literally enough. The idea that pre-Columbian communities in the Mississippi Valley engineered water management systems, dug canals, built berms, and modified the natural hydrology of the floodplain to suit their agricultural and transportation needs is not new. Archaeological evidence for water management in the Mississippian world has been accumulating since at least the 1970s. But the scale of that water management, the full extent to which the communities of the Mississippi corridor modified and managed their hydrological environment, is something that the LiDAR revolution has revised dramatically upward in recent years. And the oral traditions, when reread in light of the new evidence, turn out to have been describing something much larger and more systematic than anyone had previously understood. The Mississippian communities were not passive in their relationship with the river. This is the fundamental reorientation that the new evidence requires. For a long time, the dominant narrative was that Mississippian communities chose their settlement locations primarily in response to the river's natural behavior, positioning themselves on the elevated ground of natural levees and ridge crests to take advantage of both the agricultural potential of the adjacent lands and the protection from ordinary flood levels that elevation provided. And this is true as far as it goes. But what the LiDAR imagery is revealing is that it does not go nearly far enough. The communities were not just responding to the natural topography of the floodplain. They were modifying it. They were digging drainage channels to drain waterlogged areas and make them suitable for cultivation. They were building water control structures to manage the timing and depth of flooding in their agricultural areas. They were creating connected systems of ponds and channels that served functions ranging from fish management to transportation to the control of water flow for agricultural purposes. They were, in other words, hydraulic engineers working at a landscape scale and with a degree of sophistication that the surface evidence had badly underestimated. The canal systems that are most clearly visible in LiDAR imagery are generally located at a certain distance back from the main river channel. In the broad floodplain areas where the topography is complex and where the natural hydrology creates a patchwork of wet and dry areas whose productivity can be dramatically increased by relatively modest human intervention. In these areas, the LiDAR reveals linear features, low ridges and shallow depressions that do not correspond to any natural depositional or erosional process, but that make perfect sense as elements of a water management system, because their layout follows the local topography in ways that direct water flow from high areas to low areas through controlled pathways rather than the random natural drainage that would otherwise prevail. Where excavations have been done to test these features, the subsurface material is consistent with deliberate construction. The fill in the channel features is different from the surrounding natural deposits in ways that indicate they were dug through the natural stratigraphy rather than formed by natural processes. And in some cases, the channel features contain cultural material, artifacts and charcoal and botanical remains that can be dated and that provide information about when the canals were in use and what was happening around them at the time. The oral traditions that reference these canal systems are distributed among multiple tribal nations, but they share certain common elements that suggest they are all describing variants of the same underlying reality. They describe a time when the land was managed in ways that are no longer practiced, when the ancestors did things with the water that took generations of knowledge to learn, and that, once the communities that held that knowledge were disrupted, could not be easily reconstructed. They describe specific types of features by name, and the names when translated refer to things like the straight water, meaning a canal as distinct from a natural stream, and the made pond, meaning a managed impoundment as distinct from a natural lake. They describe the purposes these features served, not just agriculture, but also transportation, because a connected network of canals through the floodplain provided a means of moving goods by canoe through areas that would otherwise require overland portage. And they describe the maintenance requirements of the system, the seasonal work of clearing the canals of sediment and vegetation that was necessary to keep them functional. This is practical engineering knowledge, the kind of knowledge that only makes sense to preserve if you are describing a real system that was really managed in the way the tradition describes. The transportation function of the canal networks is particularly interesting because it connects to a broader picture of how the Mississippi River system functioned as an infrastructure network for the Mississippian world. The river and its tributaries were, in the most direct and literal sense, the highways of the Mississippian cultural sphere. Canoes were the primary mode of long-distance transport for goods and people, and the rivers were the routes along which the vast exchange networks of the period operated. The distribution of specific artifact types in the archaeological record reflects the river network directly. Prestige goods like marine shells from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes region, and chert from specific quarry locations are found at sites hundreds or thousands of miles from their sources, distributed along the waterway corridors in patterns that document the existence of sustained, organized, long-distance trade. The Mississippi was the central artery of this network, connecting the southern trade routes of the Gulf Coast with the northern routes of the Great Lakes system, and every major community along its length was participating in the exchange in some way. The canals extended this network into the floodplain interior. They allowed goods to be moved from community to community through the interconnected back-channel waterways of the river bottomlands without having to go back to the main stem for every short-haul movement. They were feeder routes, neighborhood streets in the larger transportation network that the river and its tributaries constituted. And their existence implies a level of inter-community coordination that goes beyond what you would expect from loosely affiliated, independent communities. You do not build a multi-community canal network through a shared floodplain without some form of governance structure capable of organizing the labor and managing the competing interests of the communities involved. The canal networks are, in other words, physical evidence of a degree of political and social organization in the Mississippian world that goes beyond what the more narrowly focused ceremonial center archaeology had suggested. This is a point that the oral traditions have been making consistently for a very long time. The traditions of multiple tribal nations describe the Mississippian period, or what they describe as the time of the Great Work, using language that implies not just the presence of impressive structures, but the existence of large-scale cooperative organization, community-to-community agreements, and what sounds in the descriptions very much like regional governance. The traditions are not specific about the exact form of that governance, because governance is the kind of thing that is harder to encode precisely in oral tradition than physical landmarks and events. But they are consistent in describing a period when communities along the river were more connected and more collectively organized than they became after the transformations of the late Mississippian period. They describe this as a loss. They described the period after as a fragmentation, a dispersal, a time when the connections that had held things together weakened and communities that had been part of a larger whole became more isolated and more vulnerable. This narrative of loss and fragmentation, which runs through the oral traditions of many Mississippian descending communities, corresponds in its general outlines to what archaeology has documented as the Cahokia decline and the broader Mississippian cultural transformation of the 14th and 15th centuries. The causes of that transformation are still debated. They probably include climatic factors, the same period of climatic instability that the geological record shows affecting the river hydrology during this period, combined with agricultural stress, political tensions, and possibly epidemic disease. Though the epidemic argument is controversial, and depends on how early European contact vectors can be shown to have penetrated into the interior of the continent. But whatever the causes, the result is clear in the archaeological record. The large ceremonial centers contracted, and in some cases were abandoned. The dense networks of smaller communities that surrounded them thinned out. The long-distance exchange networks shrank. The canal systems fell into disuse and began to fill with natural sediment. And the overall density of human occupation in the Mississippi corridor dropped substantially from what it had been at the peak of the Mississippian fluorescence. The things that had been built at the peak, the mound complexes and the plazas and the canal networks and the community clusters that had filled the floodplain, did not all disappear immediately. Some were maintained for generations after the peak had passed. Some were visited and used ceremonially long after they had ceased to function as permanent settlements. But over the course of several centuries, they gradually went out of active use. And as they fell out of active use, the river continued to do what rivers do. The canals filled with sediment and began to look like natural features. The smaller mounds lost definition as their earthen slopes eroded and vegetation colonized them. The structures that had been built of wood rotted away. The river moved, and in moving buried some things and exposed others. And through all of this, the communities that had built the system dispersed and transformed, and in some cases devastated by disease and displacement after European contact, continued to carry the memory of what had been there, continued to encode it in their traditions, continued to say quietly and persistently in generation after generation of oral transmission, there is something beneath the river. There is something beneath the mud. If you look, you will find it that we are telling you what to look for and where to look. Please listen. We are listening now later than we should have been, but listening. And what we are hearing in combination with what the instruments are showing us is assembling into a picture that demands to be taken seriously. Let me try to give you a sense of the full scale of that picture, because I do not think it is usually presented at its full scale, and scale is what changes this from an interesting archaeological story into something that genuinely rewrites how we understand the history of this continent. At the peak of the Mississippian cultural fluorescence, roughly between 800 and 1200 years ago, the Mississippi River corridor from the confluence with the Ohio and southern Illinois all the way to the coast of Louisiana was inhabited by a population that the best current demographic estimates place at somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 people. This is not a census figure because there was no census. It is a projection based on site sizes, archaeological evidence of settlement density, and modeling of agricultural productivity in the region during the relevant period. The uncertainty range is wide, but even the low end of that range represents an extraordinary concentration of human beings in what is now considered an underdeveloped and in some places nearly uninhabited landscape. And the high end represents a population comparable to the largest cities in medieval Europe. This was not a wilderness. This was a civilization. The river and its tributaries served as the connective tissue of this civilization. The major waterways were not just transportation routes. They were, in the cosmological framework of Mississippian culture, fundamental structural elements of the universe. The river was not separable from the civilization that developed along it. It was woven into every aspect of that civilization's self-understanding, from the orientation of its largest structures to the content of its most important ceremonies to the specific form of the knowledge systems that its people developed for understanding their world. And when the river changed, when the climate shifted and the river began to do things that it had not done before, the civilization changed with it. Not all at once, not in any single dramatic event, but over the course of several difficult generations during which the accumulated infrastructure of centuries came apart at a pace that was, on a human timescale, rapid and devastating. The oral traditions describe this period with what sounds to a reader with some knowledge of what the archaeology shows like a painful accuracy. They describe communities that had to move because the land they had always lived on was suddenly unreliable. Not necessarily because it flooded catastrophically in any single event, though catastrophic floods may have occurred, but because the pattern of flooding changed. Because places that had been reliably above flood level for generations began to flood regularly. Because agricultural areas that had produced reliable yields for centuries became inconsistent. Because the hydrological regime that the canal systems were designed to manage was shifting in ways that made those systems harder and harder to maintain. These are not mythological descriptions. They are descriptions of the kind of systemic agricultural and demographic stress that paleoclimatologists have documented as a characteristic of the late Mississippian period from multiple lines of physical evidence. And they describe another thing, something that is perhaps even more interesting from a purely archaeological standpoint. They describe deliberate acts of preservation. They describe communities that, as they prepared to move, made decisions about what to take with them and what to leave behind, and what to specifically put into the ground or into the water in ways that were not the random deposition of abandoned settlements, but intentional placements of significant objects and structures in locations chosen for their protective and commemorative properties. The traditions are not entirely specific about what was placed and where, and they are appropriately circumspect about the sacred nature of some of what they describe. But they are clear that not everything that is now underground got there by accident. Some things were put there deliberately, in places that were chosen because of their physical preservation potential, because the people making those choices understood enough about the river and the floodplain and the specific depositional behavior of different parts of the landscape to know which kinds of burial would protect their objects for the longest time. This is something that archaeology generally does not expect from pre-contact communities. Deliberate archiving, the intentional preservation of significant materials in conditions selected for their long-term protective qualities, with an awareness on the part of the depositors that the materials would survive their own deaths and potentially persist for future generations. But if the oral traditions are accurate about the practices they describe, and there are reasons, which we will discuss, to believe that some of them are, then what lies beneath the Mississippi includes not just the archaeological record of an abandoned civilization, but also the deliberately preserved heritage of communities that saw the ending coming and made conscious choices about what to leave for those who would come after. Let me tell you about one category of deliberately preserved material that the traditions reference most consistently, because it is the category that researchers have found the most physical evidence for, and because it connects the oral traditions to the physical record in the most direct and testable way. The traditions of multiple Mississippian descendant communities describe a practice of depositing specific categories of ritual objects in water, particularly at confluences, at river bends, and at locations associated with specific cosmological meanings in the Mississippian symbolic framework. This practice is well documented archaeologically. Some of the most important Mississippian ritual objects in museum collections were recovered from rivers, from the silts and gravels of river bottoms, sometimes by accident during dredging operations, and sometimes by deliberate archaeological investigation. The objects include copper plates, stone pipes, ceramic vessels, shell gorgets, and other items that are associated with the southeastern ceremonial complex, the pan-regional ritual tradition that connected Mississippian communities across a vast area of the continent. When these objects are found in river contexts, they are sometimes interpreted as accidental losses, objects that fell into the water or were deposited by floods. But the distribution of the finds and the condition of the objects when found, and the specific types of objects represented, all suggest that at least some of them were deliberately placed. The oral traditions are unambiguous about this. They describe river offerings as a regular ceremonial practice, and they describe the locations of specific offering sites with enough precision that in some cases researchers have been able to verify the existence of archaeological material at or near those locations through acoustic survey and in a few cases through direct recovery. The river was not just a transportation route. It was a recipient of sacred material, and the sacred material it received over centuries of Mississippian religious practice is now part of the archaeological record of the river bottom. There is a particular type of place in the oral traditions that deserves its own sustained attention. A category of site that the traditions reference consistently across multiple tribal nations, and that has only recently begun to receive serious archaeological attention. This is the category of what we might loosely call the river temple, though that phrase imposes a Western architectural concept onto something that was probably more complex and more integrated with its natural setting than a word like temple implies. What the traditions are describing when they describe these places is not a structure that stands apart from the river, but a place where the river and human intention and cosmological significance converge, where the specific behavior of the water at a particular location, the way it moves and sounds and feels, the way it reflects light at certain times of year, the way it creates particular hydraulic conditions that have practical as well as symbolic significance, was recognized as meaningful and enhanced by human construction and ceremony in ways that amplified and responded to what the river was naturally doing. The best description of this concept that I have encountered in the ethnographic literature comes from an elder of the Muskogee Nation recorded in the late 20th century, who described a category of place along rivers that the Muskogee tradition calls, in a rough translation, a place where the water speaks clearly. The elder explained that these were locations where the natural conditions of the river combined with specific features of the local topography produced effects that the tradition interpreted as forms of communication. Not supernatural communication in the sense of divine revelation, but natural phenomena that carried practical information about the state of the river, about conditions upstream and downstream, about the health of the waterway as a whole. The places where the water speaks clearly were gathering places, ceremonial locations, but also information nodes, places where the practical knowledge of the river community was assembled and assessed and acted upon. They were chosen for their position in the larger network of the river system, not randomly or arbitrarily, but because their specific location in the hydrological network made them places where the maximum amount of information about river conditions could be gathered in one spot. This description resonated with researchers who work in fluvial geomorphology, the study of how rivers shape their landscapes, because the types of locations the elder was describing correspond to specific geomorphological features that are recognized in the scientific literature as places where the behavior of a river is most clearly legible to an informed observer. Confluences where two streams join produce complex mixing patterns and sediment dynamics that reflect the conditions in both contributing watersheds. Sharp bends produce hydraulic features, standing waves and current differentials and sediment sorting effects that carry information about the river's energy state. Constrictions where the channel narrows produce velocity changes that amplify certain signals and dampen others. These are not mystical phenomena. They are physics, and communities that spent generations observing these phenomena learn to read them in the same way that meteorologists learn to read weather patterns as sources of information about what the atmosphere is doing on a regional scale. The ritual significance of these locations was not separate from their practical significance. The ceremony and the ecology were integrated in the Mississippian worldview in ways that make the separation artificial. When you perform a ceremony at a confluence, you are not choosing an arbitrary sacred location. You are choosing a location where the most information is available and where the outcomes of your decisions about how to respond to that information will be most visible. The ceremony is a form of observation and decision-making, as well as a form of spiritual practice. And the knowledge embedded in the ceremony is not separate from the ecological knowledge of the river, but is the same knowledge expressed in a symbolic mode that allows it to be transmitted across generations and integrated into the broader cosmological framework of the culture. This is why the elder warnings about specific places along the Mississippi were so persistent and so specific. They were not warnings in the abstract sense of stay away from something dangerous. They were warnings that encoded practical ecological knowledge about the behavior of specific locations in the river system. Knowledge that had been accumulated over generations of careful observation, and that carried real consequences in terms of safety and resource management and community decision-making. When an elder said, "Do not build on that bank because the river remembers that bend," what was being communicated was a record of observational data about the lateral migration history of that channel reach, encoded in language that preserved the information and its spatial reference across generations. When an elder said, "That place where the water turns is where the ancestors placed what they most valued," what was being communicated was both a record of historical events, the deliberate deposition of significant materials at a specific location, and a practical observation about the hydraulic conditions at that location, which may have influenced its selection as a depositional site precisely because those conditions were associated with particular patterns of sediment accumulation and preservation. The archaeologists who have begun to take these descriptions seriously and use them as research guides are finding that they are remarkably good guides. Not perfect, not completely specific in every detail, but consistently pointing toward places that turn out to be interesting when investigated, and consistently providing interpretive context that helps researchers understand what they are looking at when they find it. The research programs that have integrated traditional ecological knowledge most fully into their methodology are producing results that are consistently richer and more interpretively satisfying than programs that treat the archaeology in isolation from the traditional knowledge. This is not a coincidence. It is the expected result of consulting people who have been paying attention to this landscape for far longer than any scientific research program has been in existence. There is another dimension to this story that we have not yet addressed, and it is perhaps the one that should make the greatest impression on anyone thinking carefully about what it means that the elder warnings were right. The dimension is this. The things that went beneath the Mississippi were not just physical objects and structures. They were systems of knowledge. And those systems of knowledge, the accumulated ecological intelligence of a civilization that managed this landscape for centuries, also have a relationship to what lies beneath the river, in the sense that the landscape itself encoded information that the knowledge systems were designed to read. When the landscape went under, when the canal systems filled with mud and the settlement sites were buried, and the ceremonial centers that served as the nodes of the regional knowledge network were abandoned, a significant portion of the accumulated ecological literacy of the Mississippian world went with them. What survived was what the people carried in their minds and transmitted to the next generation. What survived was the oral tradition, which means that the oral tradition is not just a record of what was built and where. It is a survival of the knowledge system itself, in the only form in which knowledge systems can survive without institutional infrastructure and written records, which is as living memory in living people, transmitted through the practices and ceremonies and stories that the communities maintain despite everything that happened to them. The knowledge encoded in the traditions about the river is not separate from the landscape the traditions describe. It is a form of engagement with that landscape, a way of knowing it and relating to it and extracting information from it that developed over centuries of accumulated experience, and that was designed at a deep level to be preserved and transmitted across generations precisely because it was too important and too hard one to lose. When researchers approach the oral traditions as sources of historical data, which is the way we have been discussing them in this story, they are doing something important and necessary. But they are also doing something incomplete because they are treating the traditions as archives of information about the past rather than as living knowledge systems with a present and a future as well as a past. The elders who maintained these traditions were not preserving museum specimens. They were maintaining living, functional systems of ecological and cosmological understanding that continued to be relevant to the communities that held them. Not because those communities were stuck in the past, but because the river was still there, still behaving according to the same general principles, still creating and burying and revealing features of the landscape in the same ways it always had. The tradition was not a record of a dead world. It was and is a guide to a living one. This is part of why the convergence of the oral traditions with the archaeological and geological findings is so significant. It is not just that the traditions turned out to be accurate about what lies beneath the river. though they did. It is that the accuracy demonstrates the ongoing validity of the knowledge systems of which the traditions are a part, systems that have something to contribute not just to the historical understanding of the Mississippian world, but to the contemporary understanding of the Mississippi River as a living landscape with a long and complex relationship to the human communities that inhabit it. The ecological knowledge embedded in these traditions is not archaic. It is relevant. The river still floods. It still migrates. It still buries and reveals. And the communities that develop the deepest knowledge of how it does these things and why have never stopped paying attention. Let me now bring you to the specific discoveries that have been the most significant in the recent literature, the ones that have produced the clearest and most dramatic convergences between the oral traditions and the physical evidence. Because these are the cases that change the narrative most definitively, and that deserve to be more widely known than they currently are. The first of these involves the upper end of the Mississippian world in the area around the confluence of the Illinois and Missouri rivers with the Mississippi in southwestern Illinois. This is Cahokia's immediate hinterland, the area that was most densely developed during the peak of the Mississippian period, and that was most dramatically affected by the hydrological changes of the late Mississippian era. Researchers working in this area over the last decade have produced a body of findings that, taken together, constitute one of the most comprehensive pictures available anywhere in North America of what a large pre-Columbian landscape looks like when you combine LiDAR survey with systematic subsurface investigation, with oral tradition research, with paleoclimatological reconstruction. The picture is extraordinary. The LiDAR survey of the American Bottom, the floodplain name for the area of the Mississippi Valley around Cahokia, has revealed a level of landscape modification that was previously only partially suspected. The entire floor of the valley shows traces of human activity. There are mounds that are not in any existing site register, discovered for the first time by LiDAR. There are ridge and swale patterns in areas that were assumed to be natural floodplain morphology, but that turn out, when examined in detail, to have a regularity and a directionality that indicates human modification of the natural topography. There are causeways, elevated walkways connecting settlement areas across low-lying ground that would have been seasonally or permanently wet, connecting communities to each other and to the central Cahokia complex in ways that created a physically connected urban landscape rather than a series of isolated sites. There are fields, the traces of the intensive corn agriculture that supported the Cahokia population, visible in the subtle microtopographic signatures of ridge and furrow cultivation systems that were used to manage drainage and extend the growing season. And there are things that do not fit into any existing category, features whose function is not immediately obvious from the topographic data, and that require ground truthing and traditional knowledge consultation to interpret. The oral tradition research that has been done in parallel with the LiDAR survey has produced a body of information about the American Bottom landscape that is deeply complementary to the remote sensing data. The Osage, who maintain some of the most detailed traditional knowledge about the pre-Columbian landscape of the central Mississippi Valley, have descriptions of the American Bottom landscape that include references to features that the LiDAR is now confirming were there. They describe a network of interconnected water bodies, ponds and channels and lakes that covered much of the floodplain floor and that were managed for a combination of agricultural and transportation purposes. They describe the locations of specific ceremonial features in terms of their relationship to these water bodies, and those descriptions, when mapped against the LiDAR data, place the ceremonial features in locations where the LiDAR shows anomalies consistent with buried architectural deposits. They describe the general layout of the community organization of the American Bottom in terms of a center-periphery structure, where communities at varying distances from Cahokia occupy different positions in a social hierarchy expressed in the landscape as differences in site size and feature complexity, which is precisely what the archaeological survey data shows when the full distribution of sites in the region is mapped. The convergences are not always perfect in their specifics. There are cases where the traditions point toward a location and the archaeology finds something there, but something different from what the tradition most directly implies. These partial matches are actually interesting in their own right because they often turn out to reflect changes in the landscape since the tradition was formed, changes that the tradition has not entirely kept pace with, because oral traditions are not perfectly updated records but are more like fixed photographs taken at specific moments and then preserved. A tradition formed in the 13th century describes a landscape that looked somewhat different from the same area in the 15th century, and different again from the same area today. The tradition is not wrong about what it describes. It is describing a moment in the landscape's history that may not be the same moment that the current physical evidence most directly reflects. Understanding which moment a tradition is describing is one of the more complex interpretive challenges of this kind of research. And it requires the kind of deep knowledge of both the traditions and the paleogeography of the area that is only available when researchers from different disciplines work closely together over extended periods of time. The most intensive version of this kind of collaborative research that has been done anywhere in the Mississippi corridor is a long-running project in the lower Mississippi Valley that began as a hydrological study but has evolved into something much broader. A collaborative research program involving geologists, archaeologists, physical geographers, and tribal historic preservation officers from several nations, working together over nearly 2 decades to build a comprehensive picture of the late Holocene history of a specific stretch of the river. The physical findings of this project have been published in a series of academic papers that are individually of interest mainly to specialists, but taken together and read alongside the oral tradition data that the project has also collected and documented, they tell a story that is of the widest possible interest to anyone who wants to understand what North America was before contact. Let me try to convey the outlines of that story, because the paper-by-paper presentation in the academic literature does not do justice to its scope. The story, as the combined physical and traditional evidence, tells it goes something like this. In the centuries before European contact, the stretch of the lower Mississippi understudy was home to a series of communities distributed along the river and its tributaries at intervals of several miles. Each community occupying an elevated ridge in the floodplain, and each community connected to its neighbors by a combination of waterways and overland routes. The communities varied considerably in size, from small hamlets of a few dozen people to medium-sized towns of several hundred, with occasional larger centers that served as focal points for regional ceremonial and exchange activity. The largest of these centers, the one that the oral traditions of the area most consistently reference, was located at a position in the floodplain that offered particularly advantageous conditions for both agricultural production and river access. And it served as the hub of a regional network that extended for roughly 100 miles along the river corridor. The geophysical data shows that this community, the central hub, was built on an elevated river terrace that was separated from the main channel by a broad-backed swamp area to the west and bounded on the east by a secondary channel that provided canoe access to the main river. The settlement's position in the landscape was not accidental. It was chosen, and the choice reflected a sophisticated understanding of the local hydrology. The terrace provided protection from ordinary floods. The back swamp provided a productive area for fishing and waterfowl hunting and, eventually, for managed wetland agriculture. And the secondary channel provided transportation access without the hazards of the main channel. The oral traditions describe this location with a precision that is remarkable, identifying not just the general area, but the specific relationship between the settlement and the water bodies around it, including the secondary channel, which the traditions describe as having been modified by the community to improve its navigability and to provide more reliable access through the back swamp. The LiDAR data of the area shows exactly the kinds of features you would expect if that description is accurate. There is a cluster of mound and platform features on the elevated terrace position that the traditions identify. There are linear anomalies in the back swamp that correspond to the channel modifications the traditions describe. And there are traces, subtle but unmistakable to a trained eye, of the residential and agricultural areas that would have surrounded the ceremonial core of the settlement. Sometime in the 14th or early 15th century, the secondary channel that had provided the community's main river access was captured by a more active channel shifting from the west, and the combined flow of the two channels began to cut through the back swamp area that had previously been the community's agricultural heartland. Within what the sediment record suggests was a relatively short period, decades rather than centuries, the area that had been productive agricultural land was converted to active river channel, and the elevated terrace on which the community's main settlement was located was left high and dry, without easy river access, and surrounded by an increasingly hostile hydrological environment. The traditions describe this event with a clarity that the geological evidence supports. They describe a time when the water came from a direction it had not come from before, when the agricultural areas were lost, when the community had to make decisions about whether to stay and adapt or move. The traditions say the community did both. Some people stayed, others moved, and the people who moved carried the memory of the place with them and the traditions that their descendants maintain today. The people who stayed adapted, shifting their subsistence strategy and gradually relocating to higher ground as the river continued to encroach on their traditional territory. Within a few generations, the oral accounts suggest the original settlement site was no longer occupied in its original form, though it continued to be visited for ceremonial purposes for some time afterward, which is consistent with the archaeological evidence of episodic visits to long-abandoned Mississippian sites that researchers have documented at multiple locations in the region. What remains beneath the river and the adjacent floodplain, based on the combined evidence of acoustic survey, sediment coring, LiDAR analysis, and oral tradition research, is a substantial portion of the material culture of that community. Structures, agricultural features, canal modifications, and probably ritual deposits, all preserved at varying depths in the sediment of the floodplain and the former channel. None of it has been excavated. None of it is accessible to visual inspection, but it is there. And it is the kind of archive that, if ever properly investigated, would produce findings of the first order of significance for the understanding of pre-Columbian civilization in the Mississippi Valley. Now, let us go further downstream to the Delta, because the Delta is where the story of what lies beneath the Mississippi becomes most literally, most physically, most visually strange, and also where the convergence of oral tradition and archaeology reaches its most extreme and interesting expression. The Mississippi River Delta is one of the most dynamic landscapes on Earth, a place where the river is actively building new land, even as older land subsides into the Gulf beneath the weight of the sediment the river has deposited there over thousands of years. The Delta is not a stable geography. It is a process, a continuous process of creation and destruction and recreation that has been ongoing since the river began building outward into the Gulf at the end of the last ice age. And that continues today at a rate that is frightening to contemplate if you think about it in the context of sea level rise and land loss that the region is currently experiencing. The Delta has gone through multiple cycles of growth and abandonment over the last 7,000 years. The Mississippi does not build one delta indefinitely. It builds a delta lobe outward from the coast until that lobe becomes so long and so elevated above the surrounding seafloor that it is hydraulically inefficient, meaning the river has to work too hard to push its water that far to the coast. When it reaches that point, it finds a shorter route to the Gulf, typically through one of the distributary channels that parallel the active lobe, and shifts its main flow to that new route, abandoning the old lobe to gradual subsidence and erosion while beginning to build a new lobe through the new route. This is called delta switching, and the Mississippi has done it at least 5 times in the last 7,000 years, each switch producing a new delta lobe while the old one gradually sinks and is eventually reclaimed by the sea. What this means archaeologically is that the Delta region contains layers of archaeological material at different depths that correspond to different episodes of land building and human occupation. The deepest and oldest human occupations in the Delta are now literally beneath the Gulf of Mexico on the continental shelf, in positions that were habitable land during periods when sea levels were lower than they are today. Some of the later, younger occupations are buried beneath the modern delta surface at depths that reflect the rate of sediment accumulation since those communities were active. And the most recent pre-contact occupations are in some cases still accessible from the surface, though in heavily modified form, while in other cases they have been buried by the natural processes of delta accretion or lost to the ongoing land loss that has accelerated dramatically in the last century. The oral traditions of the Chitimacha, the Attakapas, the Homa, and other peoples with deep connections to the Louisiana coast carry detailed accounts of what the delta looked like in the past, and specifically of changes in the delta that affected their ancestral communities. The Chitimacha traditions in particular include a body of knowledge about specific places in the delta that are now underwater, described with a specificity of detail that suggests they were important enough and well remembered enough to be preserved with care. The traditions describe islands that no longer exist, bays that have closed up with sediment deposition, waterways that have shifted or disappeared, and most intriguingly, the locations of specific ceremonial sites that went under as the delta responded to the processes of natural subsidence and sea level rise that have been reshaping the Louisiana coast since the end of the last glaciation. The marine archaeologists who have begun to work in the Louisiana coastal zone, using the same acoustic and sub-bottom survey tools that the river archaeologists use in the main channel, but adapted for the more challenging conditions of shallow coastal water, have found evidence in several locations that corresponds to what the oral traditions describe. At one location along the central Louisiana coast, a sub-bottom survey conducted as part of a shoreline erosion monitoring project detected a cluster of buried anomalies in the seafloor sediments at a depth and position consistent with cultural features dating to the late Mississippian or immediately post-Mississippian period. The anomalies are subtle, and their identification as cultural rather than natural features is not definitive without physical sampling. But their spatial arrangement is suggestive, and the location corresponds remarkably closely to a place that the Chitimacha tradition identifies as the site of a ceremonial center that the tradition says went into the water within the memory of the ancestors. The Chitimacha description of this place includes details about the nature of the site, the types of structures, the ceremonial activities conducted there, and the orientation of the main features relative to the surrounding water bodies that would be very difficult to fabricate or reconstruct after the fact if the site itself had been underwater for centuries. The level of detail implies access to first-hand knowledge, either because the tradition was formed close in time to when the site was still accessible, or because the tradition was maintained with a fidelity high enough to preserve specifics that were accurate when the tradition was formed, and that have not been significantly distorted in transmission. Either possibility is consistent with what we know about how oral traditions work in cultures that take their preservation seriously, and either possibility implies that the traditions contain information that is genuinely historical rather than fictional. The implications of this kind of finding, the convergence of oral tradition with underwater archaeological evidence in the coastal zone, extend beyond the specific case to a general principle about the relationship between coastal peoples, their knowledge of the landscape, and the archaeological record of coastal occupation. The coastlines of North America have been rising and falling with sea level changes for the entire duration of human habitation on the continent. The areas that were most densely occupied in the deep past were often precisely the coastal zones that offered the richest combination of terrestrial and marine resources. And those zones are now typically underwater, covered by the sea that rose as the glaciers melted. The archaeology of the submerged coastal zone around the entire continent is one of the great untapped frontiers of North American prehistory. And the oral traditions of the coastal peoples are one of the most promising guides to what that frontier contains, because those peoples have been on those coasts long enough to have observed and remembered things that are now underwater. This is a larger version of the same dynamic we see in the Mississippi, the traditions pointing toward buried evidence. The physical investigations finding evidence where the traditions pointed. The convergence demanding a revision of the standard picture in the direction of greater complexity and greater temporal depth. And it carries the same implication. If we want to understand the full scope of human occupation and cultural development in North America, we cannot limit ourselves to what is visible on the surface. We have to be willing to look beneath it, and we have to be willing to use every available guide to where to look, including the guides that have been available for centuries and that we were too inclined toward dismissal to consult. Now let me tell you about the cosmological dimension of the river, because we have been talking about physical structures and canal networks and hydrological evidence in a way that is accurate as far as it goes, but that risks leaving out something essential. The Mississippi was not, for the people who built their civilization along it, primarily an engineering challenge or an agricultural resource or a transportation network. It was those things, but they were secondary to what it was primarily, which was a cosmological axis. It was the center of the world, the spine of the universe, the path between the realms. Understanding that cosmological dimension is essential to understanding why certain things were built where they were built, why certain places were chosen for ritual significance, and why the oral traditions preserve what they preserve with the specific emphases they have. The Mississippian cosmological system, reconstructed from a combination of the material record, the iconographic evidence in the objects and the mounds, and the oral traditions of descending communities, divided the universe into three realms: the upper world, the this world, and the underworld. The upper world was the sky, the realm of celestial order, regular and predictable, associated with the sun and the sky beings, and with the kinds of knowledge that came from careful observation of astronomical phenomena. The underworld was beneath the surface, beneath the earth and the water, the realm of powerful but chaotic forces associated with fertility and moisture, and the creative potential that was not yet organized into the orderly patterns of the upper world. The this world was the realm of human experience, the surface of the earth, the interface between the order above and the chaos below, the place where the two forces met, and where the proper management of that meeting was the central task of civilization. The river was special in this framework because it was one of the primary interfaces between the this world and the underworld. Water was the pathway to the underworld, and the river, which disappeared into the earth at springs and emerged from the earth at other springs, which went underground in some places and appeared above ground in others, which carved channels downward into the earth as it flowed, was a continuous living conduit between the surface and the realm below. The ritual significance of the river in Mississippian culture was not metaphorical. It was structural. The river was cosmologically important because it was the place where access to the underworld was most directly available. And access to the underworld was important because the underworld was the source of the fertility and creative power on which the community depended. This cosmological framework explains a great deal about the specific choices made in the siting and construction of Mississippian ceremonial centers. The large mounds were not random. They were positioned in deliberate relationship to the river, and that relationship reflected the cosmological structure. The largest and most important mounds were typically positioned to maximize both the visual relationship to the river and the astronomical relationships to celestial events, because they were functioning as interfaces between all three realms simultaneously, anchoring the connection between the upper world above and the underworld below through the physical substance of this world in which they stood. The plazas that the mounds typically surrounded were not just open spaces. They were representations of the flat, ordered surface of this world, bounded by the mounds that marked the edges of the cosmos and used for ceremonies that reinforced the proper structure of the three-realm universe. The oral traditions preserve this cosmological framework in compressed but recoverable form. When elders describe specific places along the river as being particularly sacred or particularly significant, they are often drawing on a cosmological rationale that, unpacked from its ceremonial language, amounts to a description of the specific structural role that place played in the three-realm framework. A place described as where the water goes down is not just a hydrological observation. It is a cosmological statement about the underworld access that the place provides. A place described as where the sky touches the water is a description of a location where the alignment of the visible sky with specific astronomical events is reflected in the surface of the river at particular times of year, creating a visual phenomenon that was interpreted in the Mississippian cosmological framework as a direct connection between the upper world and the water pathway to the underworld. These cosmological descriptions, when mapped onto the actual landscape with the help of the physical evidence, consistently point towards specific locations that have the real physical characteristics implied by the cosmological language. The places where the water goes down turn out to be places with specific geological characteristics that produce the hydraulic phenomena described. The places where the sky touches the water turn out to be locations where the specific alignment of the river bend and the surrounding topography creates an unobstructed sight line to the horizon in a direction that corresponds to a significant astronomical event. The cosmological language was not an overlay added to arbitrary locations. It was a description of real landscape features encoded in a symbolic vocabulary that made the features cosmologically legible and therefore memorable and transmissible. This is one of the most elegant aspects of the Mississippian knowledge system, and one of the reasons its oral traditions are such good guides to the physical landscape. The cosmological framework and the ecological observation were not separate. They were the same thing expressed in different registers. The same observation that produced the cosmological statement also produced the practical knowledge about how to use that location, what it told you about the river state, what you could expect from it at different times of year, how to manage your relationship with it in ways that maximize the benefits and minimize the risks. The tradition preserved both registers simultaneously in a form that allowed later generations to recover both if they approached the tradition with the right kind of interpretive attention. The researchers who have been most successful at using the oral traditions as archaeological guides are precisely the ones who have learned to read them in this dual register. To hear both the cosmological statement and the practical ecological observation in the same description, and to use both as data. This requires a kind of interpretive fluency that takes time and relationship to develop, and it is one of the reasons the best results in this field have come from long-term collaborative relationships rather than from short-term consulting arrangements. Understanding the traditions well enough to use them as reliable guides to the physical landscape requires understanding the framework within which the traditions make sense. And that framework is not accessible from outside the tradition except through sustained, respectful engagement over extended time. Let me tell you about one more specific case, one that illustrates the interpretive challenge as well as the interpretive payoff of this kind of work, and that will bring us to the final and most sweeping dimension of the story. This case involves a location on the upper Mississippi, well north of the Cahokia region, in an area that is typically considered peripheral to the main Mississippian cultural zone, but that the oral traditions of several Great Lakes tribal nations identify as a place of significant pre-contact activity. The location is a stretch of the upper river, where a large backwater lake sits behind a natural sand levee that separates it from the main channel, creating a sheltered, resource-rich environment that would have been highly attractive to any community with a canoe-based subsistence economy. The lake is shallow and eutrophic now, choked with aquatic vegetation and showing signs of long-term ecological degradation. But LiDAR imagery of the surrounding landscape shows a dense pattern of subtle earthen features, low ridges and platform areas, and what appear to be channel modifications in the connection between the lake and the river that indicate substantial pre-contact occupation and landscape modification. The oral traditions that reference this location come from the Ojibwe and Menominee peoples, both of whom have ancestral connections to the upper Mississippi and the Great Lakes region. The traditions describe a trading place, a location where communities from the north and communities from the south met regularly for exchange and ceremony. A place that was specifically associated with the transfer of knowledge as well as goods, where the ecological knowledge of the northern forest communities was traded for the agricultural and engineering knowledge of the southern river communities. The traditions described physical features of this place with enough specificity to be compared with the LiDAR data, and the comparison is interesting. The main ceremonial feature described in the traditions corresponds to an elevated platform area in the LiDAR data. The trading area described in the traditions corresponds to a broad flat zone between the lake and the channel, and the connection between the lake and the river described in the traditions, which is said to have been maintained and improved by the community using the site, corresponds to the channel modification features visible in the LiDAR. What makes this case particularly interesting is the nature of what the traditions say was exchanged at this trading place. Among the items specifically mentioned is knowledge about the river itself, specifically knowledge about the behavior of the upper Mississippi and its relationship to the broader hydrological system, and knowledge about techniques for reading the river and managing agricultural and fishing activities in relation to its behavior. This is ecological knowledge, river knowledge, being described in the traditions as one of the primary commodities of a regional trading network. The fact that this kind of knowledge was valued enough to be traded, important enough to be specifically remembered as a primary commodity of a significant trading relationship, tells us something profound about what the Mississippian world valued and what it understood to be the foundation of its prosperity and continuity. Knowledge of the river was wealth. Knowledge of how it behaved, how it changed, how to work with it and manage it and derive maximum benefit from its rhythms and its resources was the most fundamental form of capital in the Mississippian economy, because everything else, the agriculture, the transportation, the engineering, the ceremonial system, was built on top of it. And the oral traditions, which have preserved that knowledge in compressed and sometimes cryptic form through centuries of disruption and transformation, are the most direct surviving access we have to the deepest and most valuable stratum of what the Mississippian civilization knew. Not the most spectacular stratum, not the mounds and the copper plates and the elaborate mortuary ceremonialism that attracts the most archaeological attention, but the most foundational one, the understanding of how to live in this landscape in sustained relation with its most powerful force, the river that has always defined it. This is the layer that the elder warnings were really about. Not just the specific sites and structures that lie beneath the river, though those are real and important. Not just the historical events of the Mississippian decline, though those are documented and significant, but the underlying knowledge system, the accumulated ecological intelligence of a civilization that managed this landscape successfully for centuries, and that understood it at a depth that no outsider has yet fully recovered. The warnings were saying, "We know something about this river that you do not know yet. We know where it has been and what it has buried and why it goes where it goes and what it is going to do next. We have been watching it for longer than your civilization has existed. You should listen to what we have learned." Scientists are now finally systematically listening, and what they are hearing, in combination with what their instruments are showing them, is confirming the wisdom of the warning. The river is not what it looks like from the surface. The history of this continent is not what it looks like from the surface. The world that was here before is not gone. It is buried, and the people who remember it are still here, still speaking, still carrying the memory in forms that are harder to access than written records, but no less real and no less true. The question is whether we are willing to do the work of access, whether we are willing to build the relationships and invest the time and develop the interpretive skills needed to genuinely hear what the traditions are saying. Not just at the level of the obvious historical and geographical claims, but at the deeper level of the knowledge system that produced those claims, and that still, in its living form in the communities that maintain it, has things to teach about this landscape that no remote sensing survey has yet fully captured. That is not a rhetorical question. It is an operational one. A question about research priorities and funding decisions and institutional relationships that are being answered in real time by the choices that archaeologists and geologists and ecologists and tribal nations and government agencies are making right now about how to approach the Mississippi River corridor. The choices are not all being made in the right direction. There is still an enormous amount of ground to be made up from the centuries of dismissal and neglect. But the trend is moving. The conversation is happening. The discoveries are being made. And the picture that is emerging from the combination of everything we know and everything the traditions have always known is of a river valley that deserves to be understood in its full depth and complexity. A river valley that has always been and still is one of the most extraordinary and most consequential landscapes in the history of human civilization on this planet. Let us go deeper now into the specific science of what happens to things when they go into the river. Because the more you understand the preservation mechanics, the more clearly you can see why what is down there matters and why the elder traditions are such precise guides to its location. The Mississippi River is not a uniform burial environment. It is a patchwork of dozens of different depositional zones, each of which has its own burial chemistry, its own rate of sediment accumulation, its own preservation potential for different categories of archaeological material. Understanding this patchwork is essential to understanding both what has survived and how the people who watched the river over generations came to understand where the best burial conditions were and how to use them deliberately. The main channel of the river, as we have discussed, is generally too energetic for good preservation of anything that is not made of stone or fired ceramic. The bed of the active channel is subject to continuous reworking by the current, and the scour holes that form at the outside of bends in the meandering channel are particularly aggressive environments in which nothing fragile survives intact. Paradoxically, however, these very scour holes are also one of the best places to find artifacts that have survived, because they are sometimes places where material eroded from the surrounding floodplain, including old mound deposits and buried settlement areas, gets concentrated by the hydraulics of the river. Artifacts that have been liberated from their original context by bank erosion or channel migration sometimes get transported to scour holes and deposited there in concentrations that reflect the lithological and artifact types of the upstream source areas. This is how some of the most significant Mississippian artifacts in museum collections ended up in river contexts. Not because they were originally deposited in the river, though some were, but because they were eroded out of floodplain deposits and concentrated in secondary accumulations by river hydraulics. The back swamp areas, those low-lying zones between the natural levees and the valley walls that fill with fine sediment during floods and drain slowly afterward, are among the best preservation environments in the entire river system. These areas accumulate sediment slowly but continuously, building up at rates that might average a fraction of an inch per year during normal conditions, but that spike dramatically during major flood events when the river overtops its banks and deposits thick layers of suspended sediment in the low areas behind the levees. The chemistry of back swamp sediments is generally reducing, meaning the oxygen levels are low enough to prevent or significantly slow the microbial decay of organic material. Wooden structures, organic debris, botanical remains, leather and cordage, all the things that typically do not survive archaeological preservation in well-drained upland soils can persist in back swamp deposits for centuries under the right conditions. The Oxbow Lakes are probably the single best preservation environment in the entire floodplain system. These are the former river channels that have been cut off from the main flow when the river straightens itself by cutting through the neck of a meander bend, creating a new shorter channel and leaving the old bend as a closed water body that gradually fills with sediment. The isolation of Oxbow Lakes from the main current means they accumulate sediment quietly without the disturbance of active channel processes, and the permanently waterlogged conditions in their sediments are extremely favorable for organic preservation. Archaeologists working in the Mississippi Valley have recovered extraordinary organic assemblages from Oxbow Lake sediments. Wooden artifacts with their original surfaces intact, plant fiber cordage still flexible enough to be unbraided and examined. Food remains in identifiable condition. Even in some cases, insect remains and pollen that provide detailed information about the environment at the time of deposition. The oxbow lakes of the Mississippi floodplain are in essence buried time capsules, sealed by their own sedimentation and waiting to be opened. What the oral traditions knew, and what the careful observer of the river learns relatively quickly, is that the behavior of these environments is predictable. The back swamps are in the same places generation after generation because they are controlled by the underlying topography of the floodplain surface. And the underlying topography changes only gradually unless the river does something dramatic. The oxbow lakes form in a sequence that anyone who has watched the river for long enough can learn to anticipate, because the meander bends that produce them develop over decades, and their eventual cutoff follows a logic that is legible in the shape of the bend and the rate at which it is migrating. The people who watched this river for generations knew where the back swamps were going to be, knew where the new oxbow lakes were going to form, knew which environments were going to produce the best long-term preservation for material that needed to survive. And the traditions that describe where things were placed, where things were buried, where things were built to last, were describing placements that reflected this knowledge. Placements designed to use the natural preservation dynamics of the river system in the same way that modern archivists design preservation environments for fragile materials. This is a sophisticated form of engineering knowledge, not the kind of knowledge that comes from a single generation of observation, but the kind that accumulates over centuries of watching and learning and testing and refining. The river has been teaching the people along it everything it knows for 12,000 years, and the people have been learning. The oral traditions are the record of that learning. They are a curriculum developed in the most demanding possible school, the school of sustained coexistence with one of the most powerful and most dynamic natural systems on Earth. And the curriculum includes lessons about preservation and burial, and the long-term behavior of landscapes that have direct practical applications for archaeology if you know how to read them. The specific lesson most relevant to archaeology is the lesson about where to look. The traditions do not, of course, say look in the oxbow lake for the buried platform structures in the language of a modern archaeological site report. They say things like the water that no longer flows holds what was placed there when it last flowed, which is a description accurate at the level of practical principle of exactly how oxbow lake preservation works. They say things like, the place where the land is low and wet in spring but dry in summer is where the old ones put the things that needed to last, which is a description accurate as a general principle of back swamp burial and the preservation advantages it provides. These are not mystical statements. They are ecological knowledge in the only form available to a tradition that predates the technical vocabulary of sedimentology and fluvial geomorphology. When translated from their traditional vocabulary into the vocabulary of contemporary earth science, they say exactly what contemporary earth science says about where to find the best preserved material in a river floodplain. The researchers who have been most productive in the Mississippi corridor are the ones who have learned this translation, who have developed the fluency to move between the traditional ecological knowledge vocabulary and the scientific vocabulary, and to recognize when the two vocabularies are saying the same thing. This translation work is not simple. It requires sustained engagement with both knowledge systems, a willingness to take seriously the traditional vocabulary on its own terms rather than immediately trying to map it onto scientific concepts, and enough scientific expertise to recognize when the mapping is genuine and when it is superficial or misleading. But where it has been done well, the results have been consistently striking. The traditional knowledge pointing toward locations with real archaeological significance, the archaeological investigation confirming what the traditional knowledge pointed toward, and the combination producing a more complete picture than either source could have produced alone. One of the most striking examples of this translation work that has been documented in the accessible literature involves the relationship between Mississippian oral traditions about underwater places and the physical oceanography of the lower Mississippi River Delta. Several oral traditions from the lower Mississippi area describe places that are beneath the water, not because the river flooded them, but because the land itself went down, because the ground sank beneath the community's feet over a period of generations in a process that the traditions describe with unmistakable accuracy as slow, ongoing, and continuing. This is a description of natural subsidence, the compaction of delta sediments under their own weight, which is the dominant process driving land loss in coastal Louisiana today. The traditions describe this process not as a catastrophe, but as a fact of life in this landscape. Something that the ancestors understood, accommodated, and planned around in ways that modern delta communities, built on the assumption that land is permanent and only water moves conspicuously, have not. The specific sites that the traditions say went down this way, through subsidence rather than through river avulsion or catastrophic flooding, are described in terms that allow researchers to estimate their current depth below the modern surface and their position in the delta landscape. The estimates, when compared with the results of sub-bottom profiling surveys in the relevant areas, are consistent with what the surveys find. Buried surfaces at approximately the depths the traditional estimates predict, with sediment sequences above them that are consistent with natural delta sedimentation at the rates that have been measured in the region. The traditions did not just describe the fact of subsidence. They described its rate and its spatial distribution accurately enough that the physical evidence matches the predictions derived from the traditional descriptions. This is a remarkable finding, and it is one that deserves more attention than it has received. The fact that oral traditions maintained by communities in coastal Louisiana accurately describe the rate and distribution of subsidence in the delta, a process that has been ongoing for thousands of years, is not just an interesting data point for archaeology. It is evidence of sustained quantitative observation of a geological process by a community that lacked the instruments modern scientists use to measure that process, but that used the landscape itself as a measuring instrument, tracking the relative position of the surface in relation to sea level over generations of careful attention. This is citizen science in the most literal possible sense, conducted over the longest possible timescale, and it produced results accurate enough to be confirmed by modern scientific measurement. Now let us talk about what this all means for the future, because the story of what lies beneath the Mississippi is not just a story about the past. It is a story about the present and the future of a living river in a living landscape. A river that continues to do what it has always done, continues to move and shift and bury and reveal. And a community of peoples with a long and complex and contested relationship to that river and that landscape. Peoples whose traditional knowledge about how it works and what it contains is, as we have been discussing, increasingly recognized as a legitimate and valuable resource for understanding and managing it. The Mississippi River is currently in a period of significant management challenge. The river has been heavily engineered over the past century, levied and dredged and controlled in ways that have been enormously beneficial for navigation and flood control and agricultural development, but that have had serious unintended consequences for the delta, for the floodplain ecology, and for the long-term stability of the river itself. The sediment budget of the river has been disrupted by the reservoirs on its tributaries, which trap sediment that would otherwise replenish the delta. The natural flood pulse of the river has been altered by the levee system, which prevents the seasonal flooding that historically distributed sediment and nutrients across the floodplain. The lateral migration of the channel has been constrained by bank revetment, which prevents the natural meandering that historically moved the channel across the floodplain and created the variety of depositional environments that made the system so ecologically rich. The consequences of these changes are now becoming visible in the form of coastal land loss, subsidence, the deterioration of floodplain wetland habitats, and increased flood risk in areas that the engineering was supposed to protect. The people who manage the river and the people who live along it are confronting the reality that a century of intensive engineering has not given us full control of the Mississippi. It has given us a different kind of river, a river whose natural dynamics have been compressed and concentrated in ways that are producing outcomes that nobody planned for, and that are increasingly difficult to manage with the engineering approaches that created them. The traditional ecological knowledge of the communities that lived with the Mississippi for thousands of years before the engineering era is directly relevant to this challenge. Not as a blueprint for dismantling the engineered river system, because that ship has sailed and there are 200 million people in the Mississippi watershed whose lives depend on the infrastructure that now exists, but as a source of insight into how the river naturally behaves and what it naturally produces when allowed to function in something closer to its natural regime. Insight that can inform the design of more adaptive, more ecologically coherent management approaches than those that have dominated the past century. The communities that develop this knowledge over generations of careful observation are the same communities that the archaeology is revealing to have managed the Mississippi corridor successfully and sustainably for centuries before the engineering era. Their knowledge of how to coexist productively with the river, how to use its natural dynamics rather than fighting them, how to build communities and agricultural systems that can accommodate the river's movement and variability, is exactly the kind of knowledge that river managers need more of right now. The connection between this management dimension and the archaeological and oral tradition dimensions of the story is deeper than it might initially appear. The sites that lie beneath the Mississippi, the buried communities and ceremonial centers and canal networks that the oral traditions describe and the acoustic surveys are beginning to document, are not just historical curiosities. They are evidence of a sustained experiment in river coexistence that was successful for centuries and that ended not because the approach was fundamentally wrong, but because it was disrupted by forces from outside the watershed that were unprecedented in the river's history. The experiment was interrupted before it could teach us everything it had to teach, but its results are still down there in the sediment, and the tradition that developed alongside it is still alive in the communities that maintain it. And together they constitute a resource that could help us design a better relationship with this river than the one we have created over the past 100 years. The elder warnings, then, were not only warnings about the past. They were also, in the way that the deepest warnings always are, warnings about the future. They were saying, the river has a nature that you must understand and accommodate, or it will teach you its nature in ways that you will not enjoy. They were saying, the things that worked here, that sustained large communities for centuries in productive relationship with this landscape, were developed through long experience with how this river actually behaves. And dismissing that experience in favor of the assumption that you can engineer the river into compliance is a mistake that the river will eventually correct. They were saying, listen to the water. It is still speaking. It has always been speaking. And the way to hear what it is saying is to learn from the people who have been listening the longest. We are still in the early stages of that learning, and we have a great deal of ground to make up. The archaeology of the buried Mississippi is only beginning. The application of traditional ecological knowledge to contemporary river management is only beginning. The genuine, respectful, collaborative relationship between the scientific community and the tribal nations of the Mississippi corridor that would make both of these things work as well as they possibly could is only beginning. The beginnings are real and the momentum is genuine, and the results that are being produced by the collaborations that do exist are consistently significant enough to justify the investment of more resources and more sustained attention. But the full scope of what lies beneath the Mississippi, the full depth and breadth and complexity of the pre-contact world that the river and its sediments have preserved, is still largely untapped. The picture that is emerging from what has been tapped is of a civilization that was not primitive, not sparse, not peripheral to the main currents of human history on this planet. It was a civilization of millions of people managing millions of acres of landscape, trading across a continental network, engineering water systems and urban spaces and astronomical instruments with the tools and knowledge available to them, and living in sustained, sophisticated engagement with one of the most powerful natural systems on Earth. That civilization is not entirely gone. Its physical remains are still there in the sediment and the water. Its knowledge system is still alive in the people who carry it. And the river itself, the father of waters, the long patient teacher of everyone who has ever lived along its banks, is still flowing, still moving, still burying and revealing, still doing what it has always done in ways that, if you know how to watch and how to listen, are perfectly legible. The elders knew how to watch and how to listen. For 1,000 years, they warned about what lies beneath the Mississippi. Scientists finally looked, and the thing they found was not what they expected. Not because it was so strange and unprecedented that it exceeded the reach of scientific imagination, but because it was so large, so complex, so thoroughly and intelligently made that it exceeded the reach of the assumptions that had constrained scientific imagination for most of the discipline's history. It was a world, a real, fully realized, densely inhabited, carefully managed world gone below the surface, but not gone, preserved in the mud and the memory of those who never stopped looking for it, never stopped talking about it, never stopped insisting that the question was worth asking. They were right. They were right all along. And we are only now, centuries late, beginning to understand the full dimensions of what they were right about. What lies beneath the Mississippi is not a mystery waiting to be solved. It is an answer slowly revealing itself to questions we should have been asking far sooner. The architecture is there in the sediment. The knowledge to read it is there in the traditions. The technology to connect the two is here now in our instruments and our computational tools and our increasingly refined methods for reading the deep record of human activity in river systems. What remains is the will to do it and the humility to do it right, which means doing it in genuine partnership with the people who have been the custodians of the knowledge all along. Not as consultants brought in to provide color commentary on discoveries that scientists have already made, but as co-investigators, as knowledge holders whose traditions constitute a primary source of research guidance, as members of the research community whose contributions are as essential to the project as the acoustic sonar data or the sediment core analysis or the LiDAR imagery. The elder warnings were right. The things beneath the Mississippi are there, and the full accounting of what they are, what they mean, and what they can teach us about this landscape and the civilization that developed in it, and the river that shaped them both, is a story that is only now, slowly and seriously, and with the appropriate combination of scientific rigor and respectful attention to the knowledge that has always known where to look, beginning to be told. The river flows. It has always flowed. It will flow long after every generation alive today has gone the way of the Mississippian cities, which is to say into the sediment, into the record, into the long memory of the earth. And somewhere beneath the brown water and the shifting mud, beneath the sandbars that appear in summer and the flooded banks of spring, the old world waits, not waiting to be rescued, because it is not lost, waiting to be recognized by the instruments that can see through mud and water, by the scientists who are willing to follow the guidance of people who have always known, by anyone who looks at a river and understands that what they are seeing is not just water. It is time. It is record. It is memory made physical, flowing always and forever toward the sea. The elders warned. The scientists looked. The river revealed. And the story, as it always does, was bigger and older and more extraordinary than anyone who had not been listening could have imagined. In the dark, at the bottom of the water, the old world is still there. Still there. Still waiting for the rest of us to catch up to what the keepers of memory have always known. There is a moment, if you have ever stood on the banks of a great river at night, when the water and the sky seem to merge, when the stars reflect in the current, and the current seems to carry them downstream towards some destination beyond sight, and the boundary between the flowing water and the eternal darkness above it blurs into something that feels less like a surface and more like a passage. The people who built the civilization we have been discussing spent their whole lives in that moment, lived their entire cultural existence in the understanding that the river was a passage, that it connected above to below and past to present and the visible to the buried, and that the proper way to inhabit a landscape organized around that passage was to be attentive to what it was carrying from both directions at all times. We have inherited that landscape without inheriting that attentiveness. We arrived, those of us whose families came from outside this continent, into a place whose depth and complexity and human meaning we were entirely unequipped to perceive. And we proceeded to build on top of it and engineer through it and rewrite its surface in our own image, largely unaware that what we were building on had its own history, its own meaning, its own relationship to the forces that moved through and beneath it. The elder warnings were partly warnings about the specific things beneath the river, but they were also warnings about what it means to inhabit a place without understanding it, without attending to its own nature and history, without listening to the people who knew it best. That is a warning we are still in the process of heeding, still in the early stages of learning to take seriously in the way it deserves to be taken. And the Mississippi, patient as it has always been, enormous and muddy and inexhaustible, is still here, still ready to teach, still carrying in its current and its sediment and the memories of the people along its banks everything it has always known about what it means to flow through a human world and what it means for a human world to build itself around the power and the permanence and the beautiful, indifferent, instructive movement of a river that has been here far longer than any of us, and will be here long after we have joined everything else it has ever buried. The story is not over. It is just beginning to be told in the full voice it deserves. The waters run deep. The memory runs deeper. And the world beneath the Mississippi is waiting with the patience of the buried for the moment when we are ready to meet it with the respect and the attention and the willingness to listen that it has always deserved. That is the story. That is what the elders warned about. That is what the scientists are finding. And that is what the river in its own way and on its own time scale has been telling everyone who is willing to slow down enough and quiet down enough to hear it. For as long as there have been people on its banks to listen, come back to this river in your mind whenever the world feels too fast and too shallow and too new. Come back to its banks in your imagination and stand there in the dark and feel the immensity of what flows past you. The accumulated weight of centuries of human presence and human knowledge and human ceremony and human loss. All of it still moving, still here, still speaking. The river has not forgotten. It never forgets. That is what rivers are. That is what this one is. And that finally is what the warnings were always trying to tell you. If you have traveled with us this far tonight through the warnings and the water and the buried world beneath the Father of waters, then you have done something that the elder tradition keepers would recognize as the beginning of real listening. Real listening takes time. It takes more than one night. It takes more than one story. It takes a willingness to come back, to return to the same questions from different angles, to let the complexity accumulate rather than demanding that everything resolve into a simple answer. The Mississippi does not resolve into a simple answer. It never has. That is part of its power, and part of why the people who built their civilization along its banks were the kind of people who could maintain a knowledge system sophisticated enough to encode the location of buried sites for 1,000 years and counting. They were comfortable with complexity. They were accustomed to the idea that the most important things take the longest to understand. They were patient in the way that people who live with rivers learn to be patient, because rivers teach patience and the Mississippi teaches it better than most. So come back. There are more stories here, more layers to the record, more dimensions of the picture that we have only sketched the outline of tonight. The astronomy of the Mississippian mound builders, which encodes cosmological knowledge that astronomers are still working to fully decode. The trade networks that connected the Mississippi Valley to communities as far away as the Pacific Coast and the tropical forests of Central America. Networks whose full extent is still being mapped from the distribution of specific artifact types in museum collections and new field discoveries. The languages of the Mississippian world, many of them now endangered or extinct, which encode ways of understanding and describing the natural world that have no equivalent in any European language, and that represent cognitive tools for attending to the environment that are in some respects more precise and more comprehensive than the vocabularies available in English or French or Spanish. The music, the ceremony, the visual art, the intellectual traditions of a civilization that was fully realized and fully sophisticated in ways that the dominant culture of this continent has only begun to recognize and acknowledge. There is so much more to say. There is so much more to find. The river holds it all in its depths and its banks and the memory of the people who have never stopped living along it and never stopped knowing what it contains. And for now, for tonight, that is enough to take with you into the dark. That the world beneath the Mississippi is real. That the people who have always known it is real were right. That the story of this continent is older and richer and more extraordinary than the version we were taught in school. And that the telling of the real version has only just begun, and that somewhere beneath the brown water and the shifting mud and the patient perpetual movement of the Father of Waters, the old world waits as it has always waited to be recognized for what it is. If this journey has meant something to you, if the river feels different to you now than it did when we started, then the story has done what it set out to do. And if you want to continue the conversation, if you want to keep exploring the buried world beneath this continent and the people who have always known it was there, then follow along and we will keep going. Because this river is long and the story it holds is longer, and we have barely started. The water flows, the memory endures, the old world waits. Let me take you now into one of the most underexplored dimensions of what lies beneath the Mississippi. A dimension that connects the physical archaeology, the oral traditions, and the wider story of what the Mississippian civilization actually was and how it thought about the world it inhabited. This is the astronomical dimension, and it is of all the aspects of this story, the one that most directly challenges the casual assumption that the people who built the pre-Columbian civilization of the Mississippi Valley were living in a simpler relationship with the cosmos than the civilizations of the old world that contemporary culture is more accustomed to treating as sophisticated. The astronomical knowledge of the Mississippian world was not incidental or accidental. It was central. It was structurally integrated into the cosmological framework we have already discussed, into the material culture of the mounds and the ceramics and the metal work, into the oral traditions that survive in the communities that descended from the Mississippian cultural sphere, and into the specific geographical choices made in the siting and layout of ceremonial centers and the alignments of their most significant architectural features. And it extended into the relationship between the communities and the river, because the river itself was understood as an astronomical instrument, a landscape-scale measuring device that recorded and reflected the movement of celestial bodies in ways that the people who knew how to read it could use for calendrical and navigational purposes. The most obvious astronomical knowledge encoded in the Mississippian landscape is the solstitial and equinoctial alignment of mound complexes. The major mounds at Cahokia and its several other large Mississippian centers are oriented in ways that correlate with the position of sunrise and sunset at the solstices and equinoxes. This is well documented and relatively widely known among people who follow the archaeology of the period. What is less widely known is that these orientations are not isolated features of individual mounds, but elements of a coherent landscape-scale astronomical observatory system in which the positions of multiple mounds relative to each other and relative to the horizon encode a comprehensive astronomical calendar that tracks not just the solstices and equinoxes, but the more complex cycles. of the moon and the positions of specific star groups at significant points in the agricultural and ceremonial calendar. The Woodhenge posts at Cahokia, a series of large cedar posts arranged in several overlapping circles whose specific alignments encode multiple astronomical events, have been studied extensively by archaeoastronomers and are among the clearest demonstrations of intentional astronomical planning in the Mississippian archaeological record. But the Woodhenge posts are the most visible and best preserved example of a much more extensive system that included not just the posts themselves, but the relationship of the post circles to the mounds, the relationship of the mounds to the natural horizon, and the relationship of all of these to the river. Specifically, the position of the main axis of Cahokia's principal ceremonial complex is oriented in a way that relates to the path of the summer solstice sunrise. And this orientation is designed to be read from specific locations on the landscape. Locations that were themselves constructed or modified to serve as observation points. The river in the American bottom landscape serves as a reflective surface in certain conditions, particularly in the early morning light, that amplifies the visual effect of celestial events in ways that would have been directly observable and meaningful to communities oriented toward astronomical observation as a primary religious and agricultural practice. The oral traditions that reference astronomical knowledge do so in ways that are, like all oral tradition content, compressed and in places cryptic to outside readers, but that contain, when unpacked carefully with the help of both the ethnographic literature and the astronomical knowledge needed to interpret the specific claims, a coherent picture of a sky-watching tradition that was sophisticated enough to track multiple celestial cycles simultaneously and to integrate that tracking into both the ceremonial schedule of the community and the practical scheduling of agricultural activities. The Osage star knowledge, which has been studied by both ethnographers and astronomers, and which has produced some of the most detailed and most rigorously analyzed comparative work in the field, includes specific references to star groups and their seasonal positions that correspond to known astronomical phenomena, described with enough precision to be checkable against modern calculations. And the descriptions consistently check out, which tells us that the astronomical knowledge in the tradition is not poetic metaphor, but accurate observation encoded in a symbolic vocabulary that preserves both the observational data and the interpretive framework needed to use it. The connection to the buried landscape is through the specific astronomical features that traditions say certain locations along the river were used to observe. The traditions describe these locations in terms of their astronomical function, as places where specific celestial events could be observed most clearly, or where the river's behavior provided specific additional information about astronomical timing. And they describe the features at those locations in ways consistent with astronomical observatory functions. When these locations are investigated physically, when researchers take the astronomical claims in the traditions literally and go to the places described with the instruments needed to check whether the astronomical alignments described in the traditions actually exist in that landscape, they consistently find that they do. The river bend is oriented the way the tradition says it is. The hilltop or terrace that the tradition describes as an observation point does provide an unobstructed horizon view in the direction the tradition specifies. The reflection of specific astronomical events in the river surface at specific times of year, which the traditions describe as a feature of particular locations, turns out to be physically real and reproducible. This is another form of the same convergence that we have been tracking throughout this story. The convergence of traditional knowledge with physical evidence that seems too specific and too accurate to be coincidental. And in the astronomical dimension, the convergence is particularly striking because the astronomical claims are among the most verifiable claims that oral traditions can make. The sky is a constant. It has not changed in any significant way over the timescale relevant to these traditions. The specific celestial events described in the traditions, the solstice sunrise position, the position of specific star groups at specific times of year, the behavior of the moon's monthly arc, All of these can be calculated with high precision for any date in the past using modern astronomical software. When a tradition says that a specific location was used to observe a specific celestial event, and the astronomical calculation confirms that the event was in fact visible from that location in the way the tradition describes during the relevant period in the tradition's history, the probability of that being coincidental is extremely low. The astronomical investigations of Mississippian landscape features are producing a picture of a sky-watching tradition that was not primitive stargazing, but something much more systematic and much more integrated with the practical and ceremonial life of the communities than that phrase implies. The people who built and used these observation sites were tracking celestial cycles with a precision that served multiple practical functions simultaneously. Agricultural calendaring, which required knowing when to plant and when to harvest with a precision that varied by weeks depending on local conditions. Navigation, which for a canoe-based culture moving through a river network required understanding how to use celestial observations to determine position and direction. And long-range weather prediction, which the tradition suggests was based on correlations between specific celestial configurations and weather patterns that had been empirically observed over many generations. All of these functions, and the ceremonial functions that both expressed and reinforced the community's astronomical knowledge, were integrated in the landscape of the ceremonial centers and in the specific features of the river that the traditions identify as astronomically significant. The things that are now beneath the Mississippi include astronomical infrastructure. They include the earthen observation platforms and the aligned architectural features, and the deliberately constructed sight lines, and the modified landscape features that constituted the physical apparatus of the Mississippian astronomical tradition. Some of this infrastructure was built directly along the river's edge in positions that exploited the reflective and sightline properties of the water. When the river moved, or when land along the river was compromised by flooding or bank erosion, some of this infrastructure went with it into the water or under the sediment. The oral traditions that describe these astronomically significant locations are describing in part the positions and functions of buried observatory features whose physical remains, if they can be located and investigated, would represent one of the most significant astronomical archaeology finds in North American history. The search for these features is actively ongoing in a small number of research programs, and the preliminary results, while not yet definitive, are consistent with the hypothesis that the traditions are describing real physical features rather than imaginary or symbolic ones. The acoustic survey data from the relevant river reaches show anomalies at positions that correspond, within the margin of error of the survey resolution, to the locations the traditions identify as astronomically significant. The LiDAR data from the adjacent land areas shows topographic traces that could be consistent with modified observation platforms or aligned earthworks. Physical investigations have not yet been conducted at most of these locations for the same combination of funding and logistical constraints that has limited investigation throughout the corridor. But the convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence pointing toward the same locations continues to make the case for a more systematic investigation program stronger with each new data set. What would it mean to find an intact Mississippian astronomical observatory feature buried in the river sediment? It would mean having direct physical evidence, datable and spatially precise, of the astronomical knowledge system that the oral traditions describe. It would mean being able to check the traditional descriptions against the physical reality in a way that is currently possible only in general outline, not in the specific detail that would allow a full assessment of the tradition's accuracy and completeness. It would mean having an additional reference point for interpreting the astronomical content of other oral traditions from the Mississippian cultural sphere, traditions that reference astronomical phenomena at specific locations without the kind of corroborating physical evidence that would allow independent verification. In short, it would mean a major advance in our understanding of Mississippian intellectual culture and of the specific role that the river and its landscape played in the astronomical tradition. The possibility is real. The evidence pointing toward it is accumulating, and the oral traditions, as always, are pointing the way. Now let us follow one specific oral tradition to its specific physical conclusion, because I think this is the most powerful way to communicate what the convergence of traditional knowledge and archaeology actually looks like in practice. And because this particular case has not been widely covered in the accessible literature, but deserves a much wider audience. The case involves a tradition maintained by the Tunica-Biloxi tribe of Louisiana, one of the most historically significant tribal nations in the lower Mississippi Valley, and one of the nations whose traditional knowledge about the river and its history is among the most detailed and most specifically geographical that researchers have encountered anywhere in the Mississippi corridor. The Tunica-Biloxi have a tradition that refers to a specific place in the lower Mississippi Valley as the center place, a translation that does not fully capture the nuance of the original term, but that conveys the sense of a location that was understood as a kind of hub, a convergence point in both the physical landscape and the cosmological framework of the tradition. The center place is described in the tradition as a location where three waterways met, a description that sounds like a simple geographical reference until you understand the cosmological weight it carries. Because in the Tunica-Biloxi cosmological framework, the meeting of three waters was a specific category of place understood as a node of maximum connectivity between the different realms of the universe. A place where the currents of the water world and the alignments of the sky world and the productive potential of the earth world converged in a configuration of maximum power and maximum significance. The tradition describes the center place with considerable specificity. It describes the types of structures that were present: a large platform mound facing east, a lower mound positioned to the northwest of it, a circular area of cleared ground between them that was used for the most important ceremonies of the annual cycle, and a series of smaller earthen features extending from the main complex toward the main waterway that served functions the tradition describes in terms consistent with the kind of causeway and access ramp features that archaeologists have documented at comparable sites elsewhere in the region. The tradition also describes the astronomical properties of the place, specifically the way that the sunrise on a particular day of the year aligned with the axis between the two main mounds and was visible from the circular ceremonial area as a specific light effect in the eastern opening of the space. This is a relatively sophisticated astronomical claim, one that can be tested against the known astronomical data for the period in question if the precise location and orientation of the site can be determined. The tradition places the center place in a general area along the lower Mississippi that researchers working with the Tunica-Biloxi have been able to narrow down based on the hydrological description, specifically the three waters confluence, which can be cross-referenced with historical maps and geological data about the paleohydrology of the area. The modern landscape in the relevant area has changed substantially from what the tradition describes, because the river has migrated and two of the three waterways referenced in the tradition are no longer present in their original form. But the geological and hydrological reconstruction that is possible from the sediment data and the historical map record is consistent with the tradition's description of the landscape during the period when the center place was in active use. The three waterways were where the tradition says they were. The position of the site relative to the waterways is consistent with the tradition's description, and the orientation of the main mound axis, as described in the tradition, corresponds to an astronomical alignment that the calculations confirm was indeed aligned with the sunrise at a specific date in the traditional Tunica-Biloxi ceremonial calendar. When researchers equipped with this information and with the acoustic survey tools and the LiDAR data that have become available in the last decade went to the area and looked, what they found was not nothing. The sub-bottom profiling data from the stretch of river nearest to the reconstructed position of the center place showed anomalies in the sediment at depths consistent with buried architectural features of the relevant age. The LiDAR data from the adjacent dry land showed subtle topographic traces, low ridges and slight depressions whose pattern, while too heavily modified by modern agriculture to be clearly interpretable in isolation, is consistent with the outline of a mound complex when compared with the tradition's description of the site's layout. The convergences are not definitive. They are not yet proof, but they are the kind of preliminary findings that in any other context would immediately trigger a funded research program designed to follow them up with the physical investigation needed to confirm or refute the hypothesis. What is happening instead is that the findings are sitting in a combination of gray literature, conference presentations, and informal research communications, waiting for the combination of funding, tribal community consensus, logistical capacity, and institutional will that would be needed to turn preliminary findings into systematic investigation. This is the current state of a great deal of the most significant research in this field, and it reflects not a failure of evidence but a failure of prioritization. The evidence is there. The hypothesis is well supported. The research program needed to test it is clearly feasible. What is missing is the institutional commitment to treat this question with the urgency and the resources that its significance warrants. The urgency is real, and it is increasing. The Mississippi River Corridor is a landscape under continuous change. The levee system and the engineering infrastructure that manages the river are aging. The climate is changing in ways that will affect the river's hydrology in ways that are difficult to predict in detail, but that are very likely to involve both increased flood frequency and increased drought frequency, with the kinds of episodic extreme events that have historically been the most destructive for both the infrastructure and the archaeological sites in the floodplain. The land subsidence that is erasing the Louisiana coast is accelerating. The bank erosion that is continuously exposing and destroying buried sites in the riverbank is ongoing, and in some reaches intensifying. Every year that passes without systematic investigation of the buried landscape of the Mississippi corridor is a year in which some portion of what the traditions have been pointing toward is lost permanently and irreversibly to the natural and human processes that are eating the river's edges. The traditions will persist even if the physical remains disappear, because the tradition holders have committed to their maintenance over timescales that do not depend on external institutional support. But the traditions without the physical corroboration that the archaeology can provide are, in the current intellectual climate, harder to communicate to audiences that have been conditioned to treat physical evidence as primary and oral tradition as secondary. The physical evidence is what can change the public conversation, what can shift the mainstream cultural narrative about the depth and sophistication of pre-Columbian civilization in North America in ways that the oral traditions alone, however compelling, have not yet been able to do. And that shift in the public narrative is important not just for the intrinsic value of historical accuracy, but because the historical accuracy has direct bearing on contemporary questions about the rights and sovereignty and cultural claims of the tribal nations whose ancestral civilization built this world. If the mainstream culture understood, genuinely and viscerally understood, that the Mississippi River Corridor was the site of a major pre-Columbian civilization comparable in scale and sophistication to the civilizations of the ancient world. A civilization that built cities and engineered water systems and tracked astronomical cycles and traded across a continent. The conversation about what contemporary native nations are owed and what contemporary American society has inherited would have a different quality to it. Not a magical or automatic quality, because understanding history does not automatically produce justice, but a more honest quality, one grounded in a more accurate account of what was actually here and what was actually taken and what is actually still in the oral traditions and the buried sediment and the living expertise of the communities that never left, waiting to be recognized. That recognition is what the elder warnings were ultimately calling for. Not just the recognition of specific archaeological sites, not just the validation of specific traditional knowledge claims, but the recognition of an entire civilizational history, an entire depth and duration of human achievement and human relationship to a landscape that has been systematically underestimated and undermeasured and misrepresented for as long as the dominant culture of this continent has been in existence. The warnings were saying, "This is real. This was here. We remember it. You should know about it. You should care about it. Because what was here is part of what you are standing on. And what you are standing on has a history that is longer and richer and more consequential than the story you have been telling about it. And that longer and richer story is not over. It is continuing in the traditions, in the sediment, in the river, in the work of the researchers who are finally, tentatively, beginning to do justice to what the warnings have always been pointing toward. There is something that has not yet been said in this story that needs to be said. Something about the nature of memory itself, and why the elder warning survived when so much else did not. Because that question is not separate from the question of what lies beneath the Mississippi. It is the same question approached from a different angle. The question of how knowledge persists across time without writing, across generations without institutions, across disruption and displacement and catastrophe, without the external scaffolding that literate cultures rely on to maintain their records, is a question about the same underlying problem that the buried landscape represents. The problem of preservation, the problem of what survives, the problem of what form survival takes when the most obvious and durable forms of preservation are not available. The oral traditions of the Mississippi corridor survive for the same reasons that organic material survives in Oxbow Lake sediment. Not by accident, and not simply by being lucky enough to escape the forces that destroy most things of their kind, but by being maintained in a specific environment, a social and ceremonial environment that provided the conditions necessary for long-term preservation. The conditions that preserve oral traditions are as specific as the conditions that preserve wood in waterlogged sediment. They require the right chemical and physical environment, so to speak. A community committed to the tradition's maintenance, ceremonial structures that embed the knowledge in forms resistant to casual forgetting. Social roles dedicated to the responsibility of accurate transmission, and a framework of meaning that makes the preservation of specific content feel urgent and important rather than merely habitual. The communities that maintain the oral traditions about the Mississippi did not do so passively or by inertia. They did so actively, deliberately, and with a clear understanding of what they were doing and why it mattered. The elder tradition holders, who are the living inheritors of this process, understand their role as archivists, as keepers of a record that has no backup, no redundant copy, no institutional infrastructure to fall back on if the primary transmission fails. The weight of that responsibility is something that anyone who has talked with serious tradition holders about their work can feel in the way they speak about it. It is not a casual inheritance. It is a vocation maintained with the same kind of disciplined attention that a scientist maintains for a long-term observational program, or that a conservator maintains for a fragile physical artifact. The tradition is fragile in the same way that the organic material in the Oxbow Lake sediment is fragile. It requires specific conditions to survive, and the communities that maintained it understood this, and built those conditions into their social and ceremonial structures, and maintained them through centuries of extraordinary pressure. The pressure was real. After European contact, the communities that maintained these traditions experienced a catastrophic disruption that was for many of them the most extreme test their knowledge transmission systems had ever faced. They lost population to epidemic disease. They were displaced from their ancestral territories. Their ceremonial practices were suppressed or forbidden by colonial authorities and missionary activity. Their children were removed to boarding schools designed to eliminate their cultural identity. The specific forms of knowledge transmission that had sustained the oral traditions for centuries were in many cases directly targeted for destruction. That the tradition survived this assault even partially, even incompletely, is a testament to the depth of the community's commitment to their preservation and to the resilience of the transmission systems that had been developed over the long pre-contact history of those communities. What survived is not the same as what existed before. This is important to acknowledge honestly. The disruption of the colonial period and its aftermath caused real losses, real gaps in the record, real cases where knowledge that was held by a specific lineage or a specific ceremonial role was lost when that lineage was extinguished by disease, or when the holder of that ceremonial role died without a trained successor because the conditions that would have allowed training were destroyed. The oral traditions that researchers work with today are the survivors of that disruption, and they bear its scars in the form of gaps, uncertainties, variations between different holders of the same tradition, and passages where the connection between the words of the tradition and their reference in the landscape or the sky is no longer fully clear because the interpretive framework needed to make the connection has been partially lost. These gaps and uncertainties are real, and they matter for the research that uses the traditions as data. Researchers working with oral traditions must attend carefully to the question of completeness and reliability, must work with multiple tradition holders and multiple sources to cross-check specific claims, must be alert to the difference between well-maintained core content and more recently reconstructed or interpolated material, and must maintain appropriate uncertainty about specific claims that cannot be independently verified. None of this is different in principle from the source criticism that historians apply to written documents. Oral traditions, like written documents, can be well or poorly preserved, more or less complete, more or less accurately transmitted. Approaching them critically with attention to their provenance and their transmission history is not disrespectful. It is the same kind of rigorous engagement that any serious historical source deserves. What is disrespectful, and what has characterized much of the historical engagement between Western scholarship and indigenous oral traditions, is not critical engagement but dismissal. The refusal to take the traditions seriously enough to engage with them critically, to treat them instead as cultural artifacts whose claim to historical accuracy is not worth examining, because the conclusion that they might be accurate is not worth arriving at. That is the posture that kept the buried world beneath the Mississippi invisible to Western science for the entire time that the oral traditions were describing it. And it is the posture that we are finally, and with considerable work still remaining, moving away from. The movement away from dismissal toward genuine engagement is producing findings of a consistency and significance that should accelerate the movement further. The more clearly researchers can demonstrate that the traditions are reliable guides to the physical landscape, the more resources will be directed toward the kind of collaborative research that tests the reliability, and the clearer the picture of the buried world will become. This is a positive feedback loop, and it is beginning to turn. The evidence is building. The relationships are deepening. The methodological frameworks for integrating traditional knowledge with physical investigation are becoming more sophisticated. The results are getting more significant with each research season. The picture that is emerging is more extraordinary than even the most optimistic researchers predicted when this work began. And the picture is still incomplete. That is perhaps the most important thing to hold on to as we near the end of this story. What has been found, as significant as it is a fraction of what is there. The systematic survey of the Mississippi corridor, using the full range of currently available technologies, has not been done. The integration of the full corpus of oral traditions from all the relevant tribal nations with the physical findings has not been done in any comprehensive way. The physical investigation of the most promising locations identified by the convergence of acoustic survey and oral tradition research has not begun in most cases. The sub-bottom profiling of the main channel of the Mississippi for archaeological purposes has been done only in a handful of locations, covering a small fraction of the total length of the river. The underwater investigation of the Louisiana coastal zone for Mississippian and pre-Mississippian material has barely begun. What we have now is a set of compelling preliminary findings, a set of oral traditions that are consistently proving more accurate than expected, and a set of research programs that are producing significant results on limited resources. What we need is more more resources directed toward the systematic investigation of the corridor, more sustained collaboration with the tribal nations whose traditional knowledge is, as we have demonstrated over and over in this story, the most reliable guide to what is down there and where to look for it. More public understanding of what the preliminary findings imply about the depth and significance of the pre-Columbian civilization of the Mississippi Valley. Because public understanding drives political will, and political will drives funding. And funding is what determines whether the research programs that are beginning to produce extraordinary results can be sustained and expanded to the scale needed to do justice to the question. The question is not small. It is in its full scope one of the most significant questions in American history. What was here before? What civilization inhabited this landscape, built on it, managed it, understood it, and was ultimately disrupted and dispersed from it by the wave of European colonization that reshaped the entire continent? What is the full depth and breadth of the human history of North America? And how does understanding that history change how we understand the continent we live on and the obligations we have to the people whose ancestors built it? These questions are being answered slowly and partially, and with much work still remaining. They are being answered by the archaeologists and the geologists and the remote sensing specialists who are applying new technologies to the question of what lies beneath the Mississippi. They are being answered by the oral tradition researchers and the collaborative projects that are bringing traditional knowledge and scientific investigation into genuine dialogue. And they're being answered by the tradition holders themselves, the elders and the cultural preservation officers, and the community members who have maintained the memory of this world through centuries of disruption, and who are now finding, for the first time in a very long time, that the people with the instruments and the institutional authority to investigate what the traditions describe are actually listening. That is the story of the elder warnings and what scientists finally found when they looked. It is a story about patience, about the extraordinary patience required to maintain knowledge across centuries without institutional support, and about the different but related patience required to build the scientific understanding and the collaborative relationships needed to test that knowledge against the physical record. It is a story about what survives and what doesn't, about the specific forms of preservation that protect information across the timescales that matter in this landscape, and about the ways that those forms of preservation, both the geological and the social, contain within them the information needed to understand what was lost and what remains. It is a story about a river and a civilization and the long memory of a people who never stopped being present in the landscape that their ancestors built, even when everything above the surface had changed beyond recognition. And it is finally a story about listening, about what becomes possible when we stop deciding in advance what can and cannot be known, what sources can and cannot be trusted, what histories deserve and do not deserve to be investigated. The elder warnings deserve to be investigated. The civilization they describe deserves to be understood. The river and the sediment and the buried world beneath them deserve the attention that is only now, belatedly, beginning to be directed toward them. We are listening now. We are looking now. And what we are finding, layered in the brown water and the ancient mud and the living memory of the people who have never stopped knowing it was there, is exactly as extraordinary as the warnings always said it was. The river is long. The story is longer. And we have, in the time we have spent together tonight, walked only a small part of its length. Come back to it. Come back to the water and the memory and the buried world that waits beneath the surface of the most storied river in North America. Come back when you are ready to go deeper, because there is always deeper. The Mississippi has been building its record for 12,000 years. The traditions that describe that record go back further than any document we have. And the world that both the traditions and the record are pointing toward is one of the most significant and most underappreciated chapters in the human story on this planet. That world is not lost. It is here in the sediment, in the memory, in the current of a river that flows through the middle of a continent and carries everything the continent has ever held. All of it moving, always moving toward the sea, toward the light, toward the open water, where the river releases everything it has been carrying, and the story spreads out across the surface of the world and becomes at last visible. The warnings were true. The world is there, and the telling of its full story is the most important work that any of us who care about this continent and its history can do. Start listening. Start looking. The river has been waiting a long time, and it has a great deal to say. There is a moment in the work of every researcher who has spent significant time in this field when the abstract becomes concrete. When the convergence that has been building across months of dataset analysis and archival research and oral tradition consultation suddenly resolves into something you can hold in your hand or point at on a monitor screen and say, "There, that is it. That is what the tradition was describing." I have spoken with several of the researchers involved in the Mississippi corridor work, and without exception they described that moment as one of the most significant of their professional lives. Not because it confirms their hypothesis, though it does, but because of the specific quality of the recognition it produces. It is not the same feeling as confirming a hypothesis you designed yourself. It is something closer to the feeling of understanding a letter that was written in a language you did not know you already spoke. The tradition described it, the instruments found it, and the gap between the two descriptions, between the language of the ceremony and the language of the sonar return, collapsed in a way that felt less like verification than like translation. Like hearing the same sentence in two languages and realizing that the sentence is the same. The river, the tradition had always said, remembers everything. And the river, the instruments now confirm, remembers everything. The sentence is the same. That feeling of translation, of two knowledge systems suddenly resolving into the same description of the same reality, is what the collaborative research between indigenous tradition holders and Western scientists produces at its best. It is not common. It requires the right combination of specific expertise, sustained relationship, genuine mutual respect, and the specific kind of luck that comes from having the right question and the right instruments in the right place at the right time. But when it happens, when the translation succeeds and the two descriptions align, what is produced is something neither knowledge system could have produced alone. A picture of the buried world that is both physically precise and humanly meaningful, both scientifically documented and culturally understood. That is the kind of knowledge this landscape deserves. And that is the kind of knowledge that the elder warnings, patient across 1,000 years of waiting to be listened to, have always been trying to make possible. The Mississippi holds that knowledge in its sediment. The traditions hold it in their words. And the researchers and the tradition holders who are working together to bring the two into dialogue are doing the most important archaeological work being done anywhere on this continent. It is slow and it is underfunded, and it is not nearly as visible as it should be given its significance. But it is happening, and what it is producing is extraordinary. And the world it is revealing, piece by piece and site by site and tradition by tradition, is the world the warnings have always described. Immense, sophisticated, deeply human, and still here beneath the river, beneath the mud, in the memory of those who never forgot. The question the elder warnings have always posed is not really an archaeological question, though archaeology is one of the tools for answering it. It is a question about relationship, about what kind of relationship it is possible to have with a landscape and a history that is nonetheless the ground you stand on and the water that flows past your feet. Whether it is possible to come late to a story and still engage with it honestly, openly, and with genuine respect for what it might mean. The elder warnings answer, yes, it is possible. The river is patient. The sediment is patient. The memory carried in the living traditions of the people who have never left this corridor is patient. And what lies beneath the Mississippi has been waiting for someone willing to come. Also, like and subscribe to my channel. Ancient Tales Sleep. Good night, sweet dreams.